All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Yuri Plowden. I am the state soil scientist for NRCS based here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And I would like to welcome you all to the 2023 Agricultural Conservation Technical Training, also affectionately known as Pennsylvania Boot Camp Basic. And I think back in the day, we used to actually hold this in the barracks at the Fort Indian Town Gap, and that's why it became known as boot camp. So um, we have a packed agenda. We have a lot of people attending today. The way we're going to work it, as many of you know, we'll do all the classroom this week, and then we'll break the groups up into two different groups for the field portion. So next week will be group one in the field, and then the first week of May will be the second group. So we do have a few housekeeping rules. First of all, the meeting is being recorded. So please keep your mics muted and please turn your cameras off. And this way it does help with bandwidth and that such. So the speakers can decide if they want to have their cameras on the whole time or not. That's fine. But if everybody else could turn their cameras off, that would be great. And please do type questions into the chat so that we can have some interaction. And I think people are still kind of joining. So just to get things going, open up your chat box and type in, what did you have for breakfast today? Just to get to know folks a little bit. So go ahead, type in your chat. What did you have for breakfast today? Or what is your favorite breakfast food? Okay, I seen oatmeal. All right, people, beef jerky. Rye toast. Keep them coming. Keep. Let's get the chat going here. English muffin with cheese, bacon sandwich, coffee, oatmeal, cinnamon rolls, our favorites. All right, keep going, keep chatting. Banana. I see a lot of coffee drinkers out there. Yay. Peanut butter crackers and an orange. Awesome. Bacon, egg, cheese, bagels. Man, you guys have great breakfast. But and you might be eating breakfast now. That's okay too. So keep the chats coming. Keep the chats coming. I see a coffee. Great. Breakfast bagel. Keep the chats coming just so we can get to know you guys better. Scrambled eggs. All right, very good. Okay, wonderful. Any other last breakfasts? Oh, I do see some new messages here. Need more coffee. All right. Well, hopefully we'll keep things moving here, and that you won't need too much coffee for this training. All right. Well, I am very honored to be able to introduce our next group of speakers. Oh, Russell Redding, he says milk. Very good. And the first one is Russell Redding. We've had the great honor to have some of big names in Pennsylvania agriculture always kick off this training. And Russell Redding, as many of you know, he is the Pennsylvania Secretary of Agriculture right now. And I think this is the second time he's served in this position. Is that correct? And he was nominated to be the 26th Secretary of Ag, and he's extensive experience as a public servant, having spent more than 30 years serving Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, and Washington. He is a graduate of Penn State University, all right, go Nittany Lions, and earned his BS in Ag Education and a Master's in Ag and Extension. He is a native of Pennsylvania. So please welcome Russell Redding. Thank you.
Hey, Yuri, good morning. It is always good to start with a soil profile and a group that at least some of you had some beef jerky for breakfast. So good morning to all, and very much appreciate opportunity to join you today for the boot camp. And as Yuri noted, this has a long history, but most important is it brings us together. It gives us a chance to to interact and work with folks who are in the conservation field and so many different positions, critical positions across the state. And I always enjoy the introductions of classmates and folks who are involved, just because you get a good sense of what's going on around Pennsylvania, the types of jobs that are out there, the needs that exist for conservation. So a pleasure to be with you this morning, and thank you. Also want to say thanks to PACD and Brenda Shamball and NRCS, Denise Coleman, and you'll hear from Doug Wolfgang in just a moment, the State Conservation Commission Executive Secretary. That's the beauty of this, is it really brings the partnership together. And as we all know, and you'll learn through time, that what we do in conservation is only possible because of the partnerships that exist in our agencies, that are county governments and nonprofit organizations. So thank you all for being here, being part of the conservation community as well. Want to just note that the agenda is full as noted, but just want to thank NRCS for also including biosecurity, which I think is part of the conversation here later this morning or early afternoon. And as you know, we are challenged at the moment by high path avian influenza. So as you're making your rounds out in the field, please be aware it's not about whether the operation has poultry. It's the question of whether poultry have been there, right? So our wild fowl have been migrating and challenging us really since the last days of January here this year. So thank you for adding that. I am honored to be in agriculture every day. Feel blessed in so many ways to have spent my life working in ag, both in dairy production and in public service as well. Backgrounds in the dairy industry. Grew up on a dairy farm in Adams County and continue to farm there. We were fortunate enough, my wife and I, to purchase her family's farm about 9 years ago, and in that process was particularly important for us. I spent a lot of time obviously talking about farms and transition and agriculture and conservation, and all of that sort of came together for my wife and I when we purchased the farm, both in transition experiences, but also the importance of conservation as a part of the agricultural community and agricultural culture. And I often share the story and about my in-laws, and particularly my father-in-law. His name was Daniel, and in the final days of his life, and he had passed away right before we had purchased the farm. But in one of those moments at the end of one's life, and you ask the question about what are you most proud of, I was struck by the answer. I shouldn't have been, I guess, just by his work and work ethic and his culture and what he did all his life. He was a farmer and worked off the farm part of his life as well. But when I asked, what are you most proud of? His response was the conservation and preservation of my farm. And, it was time when I was stepping back into public service, and really those words have inspired me in so many ways. They are a good reminder that, the work we do, the work you do it with all of the Daniels, right? These are folks who are very committed to conservation and the furtherance of their farm viability through conservation. So that has been important to me, and it's been a sort of a North Star to understand that the issues that we are dealing with, yes, they are conservation and they're resource-based, but ultimately they're about people and people making decisions to make investments in conservation. So you will have that opportunity. Some maybe have already of meeting these Daniels who are very committed to their farm, their land, and want to do the right thing. I'm particularly proud here in Pennsylvania. Over the last couple of years, we have been immersed in the conservation question and water quality issues generally, but more specifically around the Chesapeake Bay. And we have a really credible watershed implementation plan that was developed through a collaborative process. It is about a partnership and the credibility of that plan that has guided us over the last couple of years. And I'm particularly proud of the farmers. I mean, these are folks who have stood up, their work, really accelerated in the last couple of years the efforts to get conservation practices on the ground. But they're also folks who, trust you. I mean, they trust the work that you're doing in the planning and the guidance that you provide, just as, my father-in-law, Daniel, and I, even to this day, rely on the local conservation district and NRCS and other partners to get the practices on the ground. So the farmers are doing the right thing. We've got a good plan. They've got resources. Last year, and again, I'll let Doug Wolfgang talk more about this, but the Agricultural Conservation Assistance Program that came by way of our budget with conservation funding last year, significant investment for the first time, sustainable investment for a couple of years, coupled with the PA Farm Bill, and then further by our standing appropriations on conservation, of course, the NRCS and USDA and EPA investments in Pennsylvania as well. Going forward, certainly, we've got work to do. We've got a lot of work to do, and it's only going to get done if you have good people and technical assistance, time to do it, and resources to get it done. And that really has been our focus all along, but accelerated now as we look at the needs that we have to meet the water quality goals statewide, but again, particularly here in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. But all of that, I believe, is possible, but it's always driven by an understanding and appreciation that there are two co-equal goals to the work. One is water quality, the other is viable farms, and believe strongly you won't get the first without the second. We have to have farms and landscapes to get the job done. And of course, giving credit to those farms who are making the investments. So I'll stop there. I know you'll hear from others who are part of this partnership, but very much appreciate the good work. And I know that you share that. These are exciting times for us. It is a moment when we have resources. We have to keep building the talent pool and technical expertise. We've got farmers who want to participate, and we have an environment and a climate that needs us to participate. So thank you, Yuri, for inviting me to participate, and to each of you, thank you for being here and your work on conservation throughout Pennsylvania. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Redding. Really appreciate it. And yes, this is a key moment in conservation and ag.
Thank you.
So I would like to introduce our next dignitary, Doug Wolfgang. He is the current Executive Secretary of the Pennsylvania State Conservation Commission as of January 2023. So we are very happy to have him. He grew up on a farm in Schuylkill County. He got his bachelor's degree in geoenvironmental studies from Shippensburg University. He worked for several years at the Lebanon County Conservation District as an ag technician and county farmland preservation program administrator. And then he also was director of the Pennsylvania Department of Ag Bureau of Farmland Preservation. So please welcome Douglas Wolfgang.
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you so much. And greetings, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and join you for boot camp. Welcome to boot camp. But as Yuri had mentioned, I grew up on a farm in Schuylkill County and have a long history of both my family and myself association with county conservation districts. So I really value the work that you do. And when we think about it, 500 district employees across the state who implement conservation at the grassroots level, and 600 volunteer board members who integrate those programs into the farming community and working with private landowners. It really is an amazing network of people and resources and commitment to conservation in Pennsylvania. So my hats is off to you for all of your hard work. But as it's been mentioned several times, it's an exciting time to be working in conservation right now. I feel that there's sort of a conservation movement, not only in Pennsylvania, but nationwide, to really, focus on practices on the landscape for privately owned land that improve water quality, benefit soil health, deal with issues related to climate mitigation and adaptation. And then, all of the other natural resource benefits associated with practices and best management practices that you work to put on private property. It's an exciting time. As Secretary mentioned, we have a new program, which most of you should be aware of, the Ag Conservation Assistance Program, which was made available under this most recent budget cycle, $220 million in the Clean Streams Fund. 154 million of that is going toward this Ag Conservation Assistance Program that the district has been or that the commission has been working very hard over the past several months to roll out. And we have, a lot of momentum going with our county conservation districts, with NRCS, with Penn State, with PACD, with local watershed organizations. All of you play a critical role in carrying out this new program, but it's administered by the commission. It's one of several programs that we have. We also have one called CEG, which is Conservation Excellence Grant Program, which predates the ACAP program, and that was made available under the Pennsylvania Farm Bill in 2019. That's the only state level funded farm bill in the nation. We have the state's Nutrient Management Act. I think Frank is on this call, Frank Schneider from the commission staff. Pennsylvania is a national leader in nutrient management. That program goes back to the initial law in 1993. We're up to, I believe, over 250,000 acres of land across the state that is subject to a nutrient management plan. So really, I think it's a standard bearer for all of their state nutrient management laws. We administer Dirt and Gravel Roads program, which has been vastly successful. Districts working in some of the most pristine parts of our state to make best management practices, working with townships on dirt and gravel and low volume roads that have a real impact to water quality. And what's so rewarding is to see the benefits of those practices, like in terms of water quality and habitat restoration with trout. So it's just, definitely something that we're also very proud of. But with ACAP, we'll see the landscape across Pennsylvania transform as these practices are installed. Manure storages, concrete barnyards, riparian buffers, filter strips, grassed waterways, cover crops, grazing systems. As the funding starts making its way to the counties and you all work to put those practices on the land, it's a meaningful time to be involved in conservation, both engineering and structural practices. The agronomic side of this is equally important, but the practices, again, will improve water quality, soil health, and also make farms more viable. As the secretary mentioned, it's co-equal goals of water quality and viable farms. And so with that, these practices, again, will quite literally transform the landscape of Pennsylvania. They'll make farms more sustainable and more productive for the next generation. We also lead the nation in farmland preservation. That was my life up to this point, career-wise, but Pennsylvania has over 622,000 acres of land that is preserved and through permanent easement, 6,200 farms, but we're preserving farms in the face of intense development pressure. We also have the highest number of young farmers under the age of 35. So we're preserving farms, installing them, or increasing the conservation value of those farms by installing conservation practices on them and then transferring them to the next generation. It's really noble work, and it's an exciting time to be working with you all to carry out this work. These boot camps are so critical and so important because it provides the skill set that we need to deliver conservation. So thank you to PACD, to NRCS, to all of the partnerships. I think it's one of the most rewarding parts about working in this field is just the partnerships that it requires to carry out this work. So if you have passion for your work and you work hard at it and stick with it, I'm very confident that in the future there are tons of opportunities in your career for conservation. So my hat's off to you again. Hope you enjoy your day and the experience. And if you ever need anything, please feel free to reach out directly to myself or the commission staff. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Secretary Wolfgang. Our third dignitary this morning, very happy to present our Pennsylvania State Conservationist, Denise Coleman. She has been our state con since 2010. She grew up in Susquehanna County, attended Moravia College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and got her master's degree at George Washington University. She has served in many leadership roles in NRCS, and we are very happy to have her here in Pennsylvania. And Denise, I think I saw you there, so please welcome
I'm right
Denise
here.
Coleman.
Good morning, Jerry. Hey, thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. Good morning, folks. If you can, I'm glad to see that Yuri started you off with the breakfast discussion. In the chat, if you can identify whether you're Conservation District, NRCS, or another non-governmental organization, or maybe DEP. It's nice to see the whole smattering of people we talk to every year at the boot camp, because it's not often do you get an introduction into a field and you're not talked about one company. We're talking about a multitude of entities, whether they be conservation districts, they may be NRCS, they may be Pheasants Forever. Oh, I see Pheasants Forever on here, DEP, State Conservation Commission, uh, Cumberland Conservation District, Westmoreland. We see a whole variety of folks. Often when you get, as a new employee, when you get to talk about one corporation. And here, this boot camp, is to talk about conservation and how we work as a partnership within the entire group, whether that is conservation districts, that is NRCS, the organization that I lead. Um, it could be the State Conservation Commission, the state end of conservation. We all work together to get conservation on the ground and get the job done. So it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I see Penn State University. So Matt Royer's here. Welcome, Matt. It's a pleasure to see you all here today to be part of this discussion. Um, and oh, I see Pete Vanderstappen. And so we even have retirees part of this discussion today, because once you start your career in conservation, it never leaves you. It's like riding a bike. And I hope for all of you that you enjoy as much as Doug and Secretary Redding and myself have enjoyed a lifetime of working in the conservation field, working with agriculture, working with forestry landowners. So it's a rewarding experience. It's an experience that I think will take you a long way. You're at a critical time, as both Doug and Secretary Redding have said. We're kind of on the cusp of of um, unprecedented money coming in to clean up a lot of Pennsylvania's nutrient problems, sediment problems, and those kinds of things. Within NRCS, we've been around for 80 years. We have a proud history that goes all the way back to the Dust Bowl. And for conservation districts, you as well have that history. But what happens is when we talk about this, we are at a critical time that just like the Dust Bowl, we're at a time where we need, people are finding that our climate is in danger, our water is polluted, um, we have, our air is not as clean as we need it to be. So we have come to a time that we really need to, be the generation of kind of the cleanup, right? So you all are part of that cleanup generation. I know I had a guest speaker speak to us at in Louisiana this past um, month, and he said to us, my grandfather's generation was also referred to as the greatest generation. In many ways, they were in America, but they're also a generation that left a lot of legacy on the land that we we, as our generation, need to clean up. They didn't know the things that we know now, and the detrimental effects of fertilizer in waterways, and what can happen when we get too much sediment in the water and eutrophication. So all of these things, we all have opportunities, and I want to thank you all for being part of it today. Um, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the technical work that we do and some of the talks that are going to happen today and tomorrow, and then throughout your um, boot camps when you're present. You're going to talk about conservation systems, and you're going to hear these presenters bring forward um, talks about not one single practice, but using practices together to form a conservation system. Um, for us within NRCS, we oftentimes do not think that nutrients are reduced or sediment loads are reduced with one single practice. There's a lot of people out there that like to push cover crops, and they like to push a cover crop, but that's an annual practice, and that doesn't last from year to year. Or they like to be pushing no-till, and only no-till. But again, another annual practice does not go from year to year. Even within our agency, in our early days when I started, and even more to that, we were focused on soil erosion. And we thought that putting structural practices out there would solve the nutrient problem, whether it be terraces or diversions or waterways. And you know what? That didn't do it either. And so, what we have found and what our conservation effects assessment project has found that NRCS has done is when you bring all of these practices together and form a system. So, when you bring conservation tillage, when you bring uh, conservation cover crop, when you put the structural practices on the landscape, and when you put vegetative filters in or riparian forest buffers, all of those practices acting together work in a system. And so I often think of that in light of our partnership, all of us working together. We all have different funding mechanisms. Doug talked about ACAP. That's the new money that's available through the American Rescue Plan Act, and that the state legislator here in Pennsylvania has authorized to do clean water work. We in NRCS, we have our Environmental Quality Incentives Program. DEP has their Growing Greener program. All of those, one single one does not get the work done, but all of them coming together um, will and continue to make a difference. So as we work together as individuals within the conservation partnership community, as we put conservation practices on the ground in a systems approach, and as we use different tools in the toolbox, I always call it our programs are tools in the toolbox. And sometimes one tool works better than another, depending on the producer. We can get the job done. So, a little bit about going back to a systems approach and what you're going to hear. Um, One of the things that's happened through a lot of study within NRCS at the national level and across the whole country is the focus on putting systems in that practices that avoid, practices that control, and practices that trap. And so you're going to hear a lot about that through your career, but it's the ACT approach. And again, practices that maybe avoid that um, soil moving, or maybe they avoid that nutrient going overland flow into the waterways. Um, those practices like conservation tillage, conservation cover crops, those are the avoid practices. That's kind of the first, when you're out there on the landscape, you think, what's going to stop making that piece of sediment or that nutrient from moving, or stop that nutrient from moving through the waterway. That is an avoid practice. So the next practice type is really a control practice, and that's kind of what I, in my early years, grew up with. The control practices are those that you see out on the landscape every day as you drive by. They may be conservation strip cropping. It may be um, it may be essentially waterways, it may be terraces, it may be diversions in the form of nutrients and pasture management. It may be a heavy use area with curbs that control where that water goes. Or it could be gutters that keep clean water clean. So those are practices on the landscape that form a very integral part of the conservation system as we talk about putting conservation on the ground. Um, and those are practices that are in for the long haul. Once upon a time, we we've had conversations why in Maryland, our southern border state, they like to put in conservation cover crops year after year after year. Very good practice, very good thing, getting those microinvertebrates giving back to the soil, all that fungi, increasing soil health. But that's an annual practice. And um, when you add it all up, conservation cover crop for the lifespan of what you may get for a maybe a concrete structure is really not as economical as you think about it, as maybe one of those waterways or maybe that heavy use area and what that can do on the landscape to for 20, 30 years for the lifespan of that practice. So then, and then finally, there's practices that trap. Those practices are vegetative filter strips or vegetative buffers, grass buffers. They may be our riparian forest buffers. All of those, when they act together, when you do the ACT, the avoid control trap, that is what is finding that all of those things working together really reduce sediment loads, reduce nutrients going into our groundwater, and reduce nutrients going into the surface water. So as you think about and you learn this week and into the coming weeks about conservation, I hope you think as these folks are talking to you, is this a void practice? Is it a control practice? Is it a trap practice? And what is it doing on the landscape? And what other practice could be out there on the landscape working together? So um, just in closing, I really want you to enjoy the weeks. I'm sorry that this one is virtual. We're trying to do more virtual training just because of the sheer size of the groups that we're training. But some of the best times that I think you'll have is in the upcoming weeks is in the field. So really looking forward to you all um, seeing you out in the field and participating in these important studies. Um, and I want to thank Yuri for making time for me to speak today, and I wish you all the best of luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. And I see that Secretary Redding and Secretary Wolfgang and you are still on. Is anybody have any questions for any of our opening speakers? We have just a few minutes. Give a moment in the chat if anybody wants to put anything in the chat. But I do have a question. You all have been in this business for decades, collectively many decades. What have you seen? What kinds of changes or progress have you seen with conservation and conservation planning in your careers? Did anybody like to go first on that?
Yeah, I can just jump in there that in terms of my background with farmland preservation, every preserve farm is required to have a conservation plan that addresses all soil, water, and nutrient concerns on the farm. And as we started to build that landmass of preserve farms, the conservation value of that investment is something that we began to focus more on over time. And I know that when county staff go out and inspect those farms, especially if they're housed in county conservation districts, there's a lot of emphasis on that conservation plan. Um, and I just think that's a great thing that we're investing in preserving the farm, but then it also has a, an overall conservation value that will carry with that farm in perpetuity. So, we've seen that, and definitely, I think as the next generation comes on board and takes those farms over and acquires them, there's a real interest in being innovative and creative, and I think that we'll see conservation practices continue to evolve over time as agriculture itself evolves.
Thank you. Did any other responses to that?
I would
do
say,
see that.
yeah,
Go ahead.
you're just, yeah, a couple of points. I think there are, sort of two things that have changed. One is I think the culture around conservation, and when I say that, I think of the convergence of organizations and interests, right? It used to be, just about one particular concern on the landscape, whether that's the erosion concern, as Denise noted. But now I think it's a fairly holistic system where you're thinking about habitat concerns, right? Water quality issues. I mean, there are extended benefits to, the practices on the landscape. And the other, personally, just seeing the uh, recognition of particularly agriculture, recognized for the extended benefits that it provides uh, to society, right? Part of that is in food, of course, and what we recognize as you started the meeting today around breakfast, right? But it's the extended things, right? It's the quality of life, it's the open space, it's the productive open spaces. So to me, this change of time, and it's a culture both within the agricultural community, but also the larger community, and expectations that have been expressed about what it is that we do and how we do it, and having that recognized in public policy, I think is a really important transformation. And I don't see it going back, right? There's a new baseline for expectation, driven by climate, driven by water, driven by things that are, important to us in our daily lives, to include food. But I think in a post-COVID, particularly post-COVID world, we see benefits of open space in society from a, just a health and you know, sort of an outlook, the psyche side of this. So anyhow, a lot of good changes, a lot of really good changes, and uh, I think we're going to have to continue to stay engaged. I guess that was my other point, is that can't be left to, and it's probably a story of time where conservation was a few people making the case for conservation, and now we need to have everybody making the case for conservation and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you. We did get
Yeah,
one more
and Yuri, I
question
would,
in the chat. Yeah, yeah, Denise, you want to answer that?
oh, well, let me
Go ahead,
answer the
Denise.
question in the chat. I see that's in from Tim Peters. So to piggyback on the first question, where do you see untapped opportunities in conservation? What is something we aren't doing now that you think we'll be doing in 10 to 20 years? Well, as Secretary Redding said, and I've said, when I started my career back nearly 30 years ago, we were the Soil Conservation Service. We had one a primary resource concern that we were worried about, and that soon the public was very interested in expanding to many areas, whether that be wildlife habitat, whether that be water quality, whether that be plant health, whatever that may be. But where it's going in the next 20 years is, I see it as being climate. Um, we we have already had unprecedented amounts. Our next year, NRCS's allocations for doing conservation work will increase by double in Pennsylvania. We'll be into the probably 60 to 70 million dollars on the landscape just with NRCS programs. And that's looking to double again in 2025 on top of that. So, and that's an answer to climate. And we private lands make up 70% of the lands in the United States here. And we've had a lot of interest in public lands and working with public lands, public game lands, public forest lands, national parks, state parks, those kinds of things. But this generation, and I think future generations, are going to see us moving out on those private lands. The need to work with one-on-one with private landowners to do work to conserve. So and that is certainly for the climate. It's in the form of sequestering carbon, whether it be planting cover crops, it might be sequestering carbon with methane digesters, it might be doing a lot of mitigation and also adaptation practices on the landscape. So not only are we going to be involved in the straight mitigation practices, those that capture and sequester carbon, but you, as conservationists, in the next 20 years, are probably going to look to say, how can you help with adaptation? How can you help a farmer that may have received uh, too little water? How can you create more water retention in the soil? Or how can you help wildlife travel along certain corridors? Because there's so much development, as Doug has said. So, really, I think that the next 20 years and 30 years, you're in an exciting time in your career. I think it's going to be focused on climate, and people like you are going to be out there on the landscape, and people are relying on you to make a difference, to help, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, or resiliency. So.
I would just echo that, Yuri, just the whole emphasis on climate and the co-benefits of water quality and climate mitigation and adaptation practices that farmers have been installing for many years, are being recognized as also having the ability to capture and store carbon. And some of the climate smart practices, BMPs, that NRCS has identified that will help farmers be more resilient in the face of severe weather events. But I think there's a real future there, whether we call it climate smart agriculture, regenerative agriculture, or sustainable type farming practices. And, Yuri, it comes down to soil health, as you know better than anyone, right? And so I think that's the foundation for all of these discussions. Soil is a living ecosystem, and if we can help to farmers to maintain healthy soils, it will also open up new marketing opportunities for farmers. Traceability and where food comes from is going to be increasingly important in the future. And districts and TSPs are on the front lines of helping to install these practices that are somewhat familiar, but have evolved too a bit as farming evolves. And so I think if we can, focus on that in the next 10, 20 years and, just really give districts and the skill sets that they need to help carry out those practices, we'll be in good shape. Thanks.
Thank you. Any last words? Very
Yeah, Yuri, just and just to pick up
Sure.
on points that both Denise and Doug mentioned, I think that this sort of how we do what we do, and I think our challenge is to to meet all of the expectations that we have to meet to get the practices where they need to be, and we're challenged by that. So the role of technology, I mean, I think that when I think of some of the work that we're doing today, uh, we've got to use these precision tools and looking at better resolution land on the landscape. You're looking at the use of drones to look at our practices. I mean, it's a whole nother topic, but we spend a lot of time looking. Things have a lifespan. It's a term that we've learned here, particularly in our watershed implementation plan. You've got to make a decision about whether you put the effort in to get new practices on the ground or go check into ones that were already there or were already put in place. So I think that's a piece is long term. How do you use technology both at a producer level and a conservation commission or an agency level? And then final point would be I think eventually we will get to a point where we simply look at what we do in a One Health model, right? I look at it particularly around food and animals and plants and soil. At the end of the day, the common denominator is health, right? And how do we manage in that framework? So I think an evolution of move from soil to conservation to health long term is where we'll look and see everything we do through the prism of health and where that intersects with a larger society. They care about health. And how do we translate the work that we do for purposes of both water quality and land and habitat in the health, the health view, I think will be critical too, and part of the public policy discussion going forward. So, but again, thank you. It's going to take people to do all of that, by the way. So thank you.
Thank you to our three dignitaries. Really appreciate it very much. Can have the hands clapping, waving hands. Thank you so much. All right. Well, we're moving on in our agenda. So our next speaker is Dan Ludwig. He is our current NRCS State Resource Conservation based out of Harrisburg. I'm assuming, Dan, are you there and ready? He will be presenting about laws and regulations that impact technical assistance. Dan, are you there? Yeah.
I am here.
Great.
It was a tough one this morning trying to get logged onto a computer, but hey, I made it. So put my camera on just so you can see who I am real quick as I do my brief introduction, and then we'll get started. So welcome everybody to Boot Camp 2023. I think we have an exciting week planned for you between our two virtual sessions this week and then our 4 days in the field next week. So as Yuri opened with, I am the state resource conservationist here with NRCS in Pennsylvania. Been with the agency over 18 years now. Started as a regional grazing specialist in our Lebanon Tech Center. Did that kind of work, helping our field offices and planners for over 14 years. And then I moved into a resource conservationist position. Got involved in wetlands and into our bog turtle habitat restorations through our WRE. Did that for about 2 years, and been here at as the SRC for 2.5 years now. So I've kind of seen the whole gamut of the planning that goes on between NRCS, conservation districts, and our other partners. So this morning, we're going to kick off with an exciting topic of federal laws and regulations, because as we go through conservation planning, we all have to play by the rules. There's certain things that we need to do. We all want to get conservation on the ground. We're excited to help our producers. But as employees of either the federal government, state government, or local government, there are federal rules and regulations, and after I'm done, you're going to hear from Frank Schneider. He'll talk some about the state regulations. So while we're all trying to do great things, there's definitely some things that we have to keep in mind that we have to abide by in our planning process. So now, hopefully, technology is going to work for me. All right, hopefully you can see my screen now. Turn my camera off. All right. So, as I said, we're going to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about federal laws and regulations. Okay, there we go. So as in any good training, we always start off by showing our objectives of what we expect you all to learn this morning and hopefully retain throughout your career. So I'm going to talk about understanding compliance requirements when providing NRCS assistance. So this is for our NRCS employees, and then we also have the opportunity to have agreements with partner employees. that do work on behalf of NRCS. And also is key, as probably a lot of you are here to begin your journey as becoming a certified conservation planner. And when we're doing conservation planning as a certified planner, we're planning that on behalf of NRCS. So therefore, it's important that we understand the roles and responsibilities of NRCS, our partners, and farmers in addressing compliance responsibilities. So we all have a role in that, whether you're NRCS employee, you're a partner employee working on behalf of us, of NRCS, or even as conservation district employees. There's all these laws and regulations that we must abide by. And it's also the farmer. The farmer has their responsibility in addressing compliance. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about the federal side of things and then turn it over for the state. So let's think about some definitions when you might have had the civics class in high school or college. We're thinking about, what's the difference between laws, regulations, and policies. So laws are those that are written by the legislative branch, and then they're approved by the executive branch, and that establishes the authority for government actions. And then regulations, those are written by agencies, and they provide clarification to the public necessary for implementation of a law. Okay, so we all know laws can be very confusing, can be very wordy, a lot of legalese. So the regulations are those that help us provide clarification, so we all gain a better understanding of what the law is trying to tell us. And then we have policies, and policies are written by the agencies, and that provides internal procedures necessary to implement the laws and regulations. Okay, so uh, over time, you're going to hear about, through your career, you're going to hear about different laws, and then you're going to hear about regulations, and then, especially for NRCS folk, we have NRCS policies. Again, that all gets broken down so we all have a better understanding of how our agencies are to enact the laws and make sure we follow them through our conservation planning activities. So let's talk about NRCS policy. So as we know, NRCS and our partners help clients plan and apply conservation practices that are in compliance with applicable laws and regulations. Okay, so again, for those of you that have some experience, you know that we fill out the CPA 52, and there are a bunch of things down in the special environmental concerns. Those are the federal laws that we must make sure that when we're writing our conservation plans and assisting clients in implementing that conservation plan, we cannot plan or assist the producer in doing anything that is in violation of any laws or acts. So, NRCS and our partners, we must comply with our laws and regulations. And there's even executive orders that are issued by the president that we must follow. So, some of the ones that you might be familiar with or the National Environmental Policy Act, otherwise known as NEPA. So, again, you're going to hear about the CPA 52, and that's the purpose of that document. The purpose of the CPA 52 is one, it allows planners to document the resource concerns that have been found on the farm, as well as recording the decisions of that producer. And then, as I mentioned before, there's the special environmental concerns, and that's where all of those federal acts and laws are listed, and we must document how our actions and the producer's chosen alternative will abide by those laws. So, some of the other more common ones, the National Endangered Species Act. So if you've been doing some planning or you're new, you might have heard about in the planning process, we run our PNDI searches. The purpose of the PNDI searches is allow us to find those in threatened endangered species and making sure that none of our actions would do anything to result in take or harm to any of those endangered species. Another common one is the Freedom of Information and Privacy Act. So when we're writing conservation plans, those plans are the property of the clients. So we cannot share that information without consent of that producer. And we've updated a little bit of our policy here that, really to make sure that we're abiding by protecting PII, or that private information is we pretty much are now essentially providing that information to the producer and asking if the producer would like to share that information with another entity, they may share it. But when it comes to our Privacy Act, again, we need to hold all that information in our offices and not release it unless we have a written agreement with the producer to do so. And as I mentioned, there's other executive orders uh, that pertain. One of the most common ones that you might hear about, especially with wetlands, is there's an executive order about wetland protection that we follow. And then also, like most other agencies, there's specific policy and how we address conservation planning and our other activities. So who is responsible for compliance? And I think we probably have got a good understanding here in the first couple minutes that it's out all of our responsibility for compliance. So again, it starts, in the end, it comes down to the landowner. Our landowners or operators are responsible for compliance with all of those laws and regulations. So think about, a producer wants to install a stream crossing. We have it in our conservation plan, but there are specific laws and regulations that the producer must abide by in order to install that practice. So even though we have it in a conservation plan, because it is the producer's land, it's their responsibility to make sure that they acquire any permits that they need to do that. Just by having a conservation plan does not really provide, we'll call it a free pass. A conservation plan doesn't provide that free pass for the producer to do something that would violate just because it's in that conservation plan. In the end, the landowner, it has that responsibility to make sure that they're in compliance with any laws and regulations when they implement conservation practices. And it's key to point out here that our NRCS employees, especially, are not to assume the responsibility. So, again, the obtaining of a permit is the responsibility of the producer. Okay, and we don't have that responsibility to make sure that any of the laws get enforced. A lot of times you'll hear NRCS is a voluntary agency. Producers choose to work with us, and we provide them their assistance to help them develop conservation practices, conservation systems that will essentially keep them out of violation if they follow that plan. However, we are not the ones that work directly with the different agencies to obtain those permits. That's up to that producer. Now, it is key to point out that our partner employees, our partner organizations, you may have different responsibilities. As conservation districts, you may have delegation agreements with DEP that allows you to issue general permits for the installation of practices, and maybe your organization is providing that assistance to work one-on-one with that partner, with that producer, to obtain those permits. So again, we're trying to keep this encompassing whether you're NRCS or a partner organization. So again, make sure you know where your responsibilities lie, but it is important for us as NRCS. We cannot take on the responsibility of obtaining permits or enforcing laws. So do NRCS policies apply to partners? That is a big question that we see a lot. The short answer is yes. Our contributing partners must adhere to our policies, and especially when it comes to implementing conservation practices. If a conservation practice is put into a conservation plan, it must be planned and implemented to the practice standards and specifications that are found in the Field Office Technical Guide. Also, we have another big one is wetlands. We have to make sure that we adhere to our wetland technical policy. So again, if you're a partner organization and working on behalf of NRCS as a certified planner or under an agreement, yes, you are held responsible to follow NRCS policies. So what are your responsibilities as a conservation planner? You have several responsibilities. You have as a planner, you are responsible for recognizing which practices are subject to the different laws and regulations. So again, if you're looking at working with a producer to install a stream crossing, you know that that's going to have impacts to the waters of the Commonwealth. So that's going to require a permit. You may be working with a producer to install a grassed waterway that outlets either to a wetland or to a stream. If there's impacts to those different water bodies, then that is a permitted action, which you need to be aware of how that fits into your conservation system. We also have the responsibility to provide the landowner or the operator with contact information. Where can they go to get those permits? Okay, so again, it's a nice thing when our districts have delegation agreements with DEP. That is a big help for producers needing to get permits to install those practices. But if there is no, if the producers have to work directly with DEP to get those permits, then we want to provide the contact information for the different regional offices in your area, so they know where to go to assistance to get those, to submit them, find the permit informations in the forms. So they can submit and hopefully get approval for those permits. Our biggest responsibility is, in our technical assistance, being able to provide the producer or the operator with all the information that they need in order to obtain that permit. So, if you've worked with GPs or general permits in the past, you know that typically maps are needed, maybe even site-specific designs, our plans and specifications. Again, we have that responsibility. We want that practice to be installed because it has a benefit to our natural resources on the farm. So, and we need the permit to achieve that. So our responsibility is to provide that information to the producer, so so hopefully they're successful in getting that permit. And so that kind of ties into the last point about, provide additional technical assistance. And really, what that's talking about is the actual implementation of that practice. So it is quite clear that no work can be done until that permit is received by the producer. So a lot of times you might run into a producer that that really wants to get that practice installed. And they say, well, you know, the permit's coming. I know, you know, we'll get going, and then, you know, hopefully by the time we're done, that the permit will come in the mail. Unfortunately, we cannot do that. We must verify that the producer has that permit in his hand before we provide any technical assistance with the implementation of those practices. Okay, so again, just keep in mind that, you know, of these responsibilities, and you know, because hopefully a lot of you are going to stay in your current role for quite some time, and as you learn these different things, it's going to help things go a lot smoother throughout the years. So how does NRCS comply? How does NRCS and our partners comply with laws and regulations? As I mentioned before, we use the CPA 52, otherwise known as the Environmental Evaluation Worksheet, during the planning process, and that allows us to make sure that we're in compliance with the National Environmental Protection Act, otherwise known as NEPA. One of the things that I like to point out to all of our planners is that the CPA 52 is a living document. It's meant to be filled out as you're going through the planning process. A lot of times, yes, it can be a cumbersome document to fill out. It can take anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours to document. However, if we start that process in the beginning and work through the document through the planning process, then it takes that burden of that big time sink of filling that out. So if you're not familiar with the CPA 52, we have the benchmark situation is what it looks like when you come to the farm. There's a no action. What's going to happen when the producer takes no action? And then there's two alternatives that you can discuss. And one of them is what the producer has decided to implement. So again, if we use that 52 throughout the planning process, it allows us to really document those resource concerns and how we're going to actually solve the resource concerns that we've identified. Again, the worksheet was also designed, so that's talking about documenting our resource concerns. And as I mentioned before, we have a section in the 52 called special environmental considerations, and that's where our federal laws and regulations are found. And again, we document just like we do for our resource concerns. What's the benchmark condition on the farm as it pertains to these federal laws and regulations? What happens when the producer takes no action, and then we must document how the chosen alternative remains in compliance. So there's a whole big list of the different federal laws and regulations that we must address. And again, because this is a national form, you're going to find that some of these laws and regulations are not applicable to us in Pennsylvania. However, the bulk of them are. So we must be able to document how our actions are in compliance with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, coastal zone management areas, typically in Pennsylvania, unless you're in the area of Erie, or there is a section of Pennsylvania down by Philly that falls into a coastal zone management area. For the most part, that's not going to be applicable to your planning. Same thing with coral reefs. Cultural resources, that is a big one. That's making sure that we're in compliance with the National Historical Preservation Act. So hopefully a lot of you are signed up for the cultural resources training coming up here on April 18th. If you can't make that one, I'll put in a shameless plug that we will be having another session in November. So have no fear if you can't get into the one in April. You still have an opportunity to get to that. But again, as through our conservation planning, we have to make sure that we're not destroying cultural resources. Our actions need to make sure that we preserve them or avoid any adverse impacts. I already talked a little bit about our T&E species and how PNDI ties to that. Environmental justice. That is where we're looking at making sure that our practices don't have an impact on uh, different communities, maybe low income in communities. So thinking about, do we want, environmental justice? Do we want to install a waste storage section? Or sorry, a waste storage facility next to a low income community? How does that appear? Okay, so essential fish habitat, typically, well, I should say typically, it's not applicable in Pennsylvania. That's administered by NOAA. So again, looking at those ocean fisheries, obviously Pennsylvania doesn't touch in the oceans. Floodplain management. Again, looking make sure that any of our practices don't impact floodplains, um, invasive species. All we do have state and regulations and federal regulations that say we cannot do anything that propagates invasive species. Uh, One of the things that as you stay in the agency, you'll hear about certain things like multiflora rose, autumn olive. It's kind of funny that you look back into the 40s and the 50s, and how did they get there? Well, somebody thought it was a good conservation effort for it. So, but I'm not gonna say it's totally tied to the federal law. But again, looking at invasive species, noxious species, making sure that we're not propagating them, doing anything that encourages their growth. Again, we also look at our migratory birds, bald and golden eagles. Prime and unique farmland. We do have federal regulations that say that our actions cannot be taken with federal assistance to convert prime and unique farmlands into non-ag uses. So one thing to keep in mind is, even though we may be putting a waste storage facility in cropland, that is not considered conversion to a non-ag use because it's still supporting the operation. So what's really looking at is, we can't promote building warehouses on prime farmland, but typically that's something that we don't get into through our normal regular day activities. Riparian areas, again, looking at protecting those. I've mentioned wetlands several times. We do have our responsibilities to protect and make sure our activities do not adversely affect them, as well as wild and scenic rivers. As I mentioned in the opening slides, we talk about the Freedom of Information Act and our Privacy Act. Essentially, that provides the producer protection from us release or from federal agencies or our partners from releasing information that's not where we don't expressly have permission to do that. So again, the Privacy Act of 1974 was enacted so that basically we're providing that protection, and it's up to the producer to, if another agency wants a conservation plan or any of the information associated with that conservation plan, we have to have a written consent from that producer to do it. One other thing, so again, we talk about laws, regulations, and policies. One thing that you are probably going to hear a lot about is Section 1619 of the 2008 Farm Bill. So essentially, that's another NRCS policy or USDA policy, again, protecting information from it being shared. So essentially, 1619 says that any employee or contractor will not disclose any of that PII information. So again, that includes about the farming operations itself, the conservation practices that are planned or being installed, the land itself, and also it protects geospatial information. otherwise maintained. So again, sometimes we provide maps, especially thinking about your PNDI searches. A lot of times we provide that through our PNDI searches, and we think that that's assisting the other state agencies or federal agencies in rendering a decision. However, because that map is considered geospatial information, we cannot be releasing that without permission from the producer. Okay, so it's more than just name, address, contract information. It's also that geospatial data that we must protect and not share with outside agencies or partners. Okay, so sharing data. So we do a lot of work. A lot of our NRCS offices and conservation districts share space. So we like to share data. We're trying, as Denise mentioned, we're all trying to work together to achieve the greatest environmental benefit. So, so there's going to be a time where we need to share that information. So again, it's key to point out that that Privacy Act requires prior information. So if you're working on behalf of NRCS in an agreement, you are covered by that. However, if there's our NRCS folks are working with our district folks and there's no common connection between the two, then we have to make sure that the producer has a written authorization for us to release that information. With that, I probably could keep going, but I know federal laws and regulations is probably not something you're all keen to want to hear about on first thing on opening day. But again, just want to take a little bit of time to go through this and get the gears going on what you need to consider in the planning process. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions.
Hey, Dan, there was one question in the chat. How can you sign up for cultural resources training?
Okay, so you may sign up if you're an NRCS employee and have access to the SharePoint. We have that. You can access that. If you're a conservation district or a partner, then work through your district conservationist and let them know that you would like to sign up, and then we will get you. On the list. So that easiest way, work with your district conservationist to let them know that you're interested in attending that training.
Okay. That's the only one I see in the chat. Oh, okay. So there is a poll to launch that I think was launched. Yeah.
I did launch it. So
You launched it. All right. Okay.
I spent a half hour babbling on. So let's see how much we've retained this morning.
Right. So put your answers in the poll, folks. All right, let's see. We only have 35 responses, and I know there's at least 55 or so students. Come on, just put something in there.
As we're waiting for a few more responses, I see Rachel has a question. Is the cultural resource training in November in Bloomsburg as well? Yes, they will be both held in the Bloomsburg area.
Right, we have 60 people in this meeting. I know a few of you are presenters, but we should get a few more responses in. Come on, folks.
I submitted my response. Hopefully I was correct.
I did too. Hopefully I was correct.
I'm not sure if Pete Vanderstappen got those answers right.
Hey, I heard that and I failed to answer the questions. I don't want to skew the poll.
All right, let's try and get at least up to 50 responses. Come on, a couple more people. Go ahead, take a stab. So far, threatened and endangered species is winning.
Reed says the poll isn't working for him. All right, Reed.
Okay, Reed. All right. And Cameron can't do it either. All right, so you too. So that if you were responding, that would make our 50. So what are the answers? Correct answers, Dan?
The correct answers are as you see them. So cultural resources and threatened endangered species, those are the two most critical ones that we look at now. It's not, we have to look at all of them, but typically the two most critical ones in our conservation planning efforts are our T&E species and our cultural resources.
All right. Excellent. I'm gonna click done here. Very good. Thank you, Dan. Oh, somebody else said they can't see the poll fully. Okay, well, there'll be a couple more polls through the course of this training, so hopefully we can figure that out. All right, thanks very much, Dan. So we're gonna push on ahead because so he gave us the federal regs, and now we're going to state and local. So we have two presenters. Frank Schneider, who is the director of the Nutrient Odor Management Programs at the State Conservation Commission, and Kate Brossaw, Environmental Group Manager in DEP's Ag Compliance Section. Thank you so much for presenting, and take it away.
Thanks, Yuri, and good morning, all. I'm Frank Schneider. I'm with the State Conservation Commission. I'm the Director of Nutrient and Odor Management Programs, and you'll be hearing a little bit later from Kate Brossaw from DEP. Kate and I are going to work together, and I'm going to turn my camera off. Kate and I are going to work together to present to you all some background on state environmental regulations and agricultural resource management. I just have to go back and say I took probably the first or second boot camp when we were in the barracks. And I don't know, that's 15, 19 years ago. So welcome. It's very good training. I'm glad that the Conservation Partnership puts this together because you will learn a wealth of knowledge and you will get to meet a lot of people. Let's see, next slide. Why are my slides not advancing? There we go. So we have a conservation partnership, and you heard from three of the players today. You heard from NRCS and Denise Coleman. You heard from my boss, Doug Wolfgang, at the State Conservation Commission. There's also the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. You heard from Secretary Redding. The Department of Environmental Protection, again, Kate will be presenting today. PACD as well, Brenda Shamball, and our Penn State Extension. So we do have a conservation partnership. There are other members to this partnership, but these are the main key players that get together and coordinate a bunch of programs and assistance. So again, it's a combination of state and federal agencies with a common goal. We are assisting agricultural landowners and operators in developing and implementing resource management plans, such as nutrient and manure management plans, agricultural erosion and sedimentation plans, or a conservation plan. And we're doing those planning, that planning for compliance with both state and federal environmental regulations, as well as meeting requirements of resource management plans that Dan talked about earlier. So the Conservation Partnership, we all have separate roles and responsibilities. For NRCS, they provide technical assistance for plan development and implementation, and they guide the producers to other partners and organizations. One thing to know, my Act 38 nutrient management program, it's clear in the regulations that we have to follow the Pennsylvania Soil and Water Technical Guide. Well, that Pennsylvania Soil and Water Technical Guide is better known as the E-Field Office Tech Guide that NRCS maintains. So right there, built into a state regulation is a partnership that has to be maintained. The Conservation District, they assist producers in meeting their regulatory requirements as well as program obligations. The Conservation District also refers producers to the appropriate technical providers and assist in application process for both permits that may be needed and financial assistance. And then PADEP, again, they help with program development, just like I do. They have laws and rules and regulations. They also provide guidance and they review permits and can do enforcement as well. And then the State Conservation Commission, Department of Agriculture, and Penn State Extension, just like DEP, we develop program development, we provide policy and guidance, we provide education and support, and the State Conservation Commission also does do enforcement on the Act 38 nutrient management program, which we'll discuss a little bit later. So just taking a holistic approach, and I have to give my predecessor, Doug Goodlander, I have to give him credit for this slide, which is an awesome slide that really shows how animal operations and all the different types of animal operations correlate in Pennsylvania. So we have the big light blue circle that's called AOs, and that's animal operations. And those are any operations in Pennsylvania that land apply manure or agricultural process wastewater. They are regulated by the Department of Environmental Protection and have to have a manure management plan. So we have roughly about 23,000 animal operations in Pennsylvania. There could be a little bit more, but we've kind of whittled it down to that. Then we bring in, excuse me, the small yellow circle, and those are CAOs, which are concentrated animal operations. Those are high animal density farms that have more than 2,000 pounds of live animal per acre or have more than 2,000 pounds of live animals per acre. Again, that's regulated by the State Conservation Commission. That's Act 38, the program that I administer. And it requires approved nutrient management plans. Now, that is separate than a manure management plan, and we'll go into a little bit more detail later on. They also have to, their nutrient management plans have to be developed and reviewed by a certified planner, and Penn State Extension and the State Conservation Commission provide that training program. And those nutrient management plans are also available for public access. So everybody that's a CAO is also an animal operation. We roughly have a little bit over 1,000 CAOs in the Commonwealth. Those do go up and down as animals are brought on the farms or animals leave farms or acres change. And then we have our small blue circle, which is our concentrated animal feeding operations. And you can see in that, again, they're all animal operations, but there are some that are CAOs and CAFOs, and there are some that are just regular animal operations and CAFOs. So there's a little bit of both there. The concentrated animal feeding operations, the CAFOs, they're either based on animal numbers or animal density. So CAOs are completely based on animal density. With CAFOs, we do look at animal density. So any farm that has over 1,000 AAUs, any CAO that has more than 300 AAUs, or EPA publishes a threshold for different animal species, and if you would be over that threshold for those animal species. Again, the CAFO program is part of EPA's National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, NPDES. So it is a federal program that is delegated to Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. And what we've done is we've made the nutrient management plan for CAOs, also the nutrient management plan that the CAFOs need for their permit to operate. Again, need an approved nutrient management plan done by a certified planner. It is available for public access, and the DEP also needs to issue a CAFO permit for that farm. This is going to get confusing for you, and that is fine. We are here to help. I have 4 regional coordinators throughout the state, as well as DEP has, I believe, 8 district field representatives that are always available to answer questions for you. Or you can always just contact me or Kate, and I think you might have our contact information. So what are the different agricultural and environmental laws and regulations? I'm just going to give a brief overview of them, and then Kate will come on and talk about the DEP regulations, and then I'll come back. So we have the Federal Clean Water Act. We have the Pennsylvania Clean Streams Law, which is several different regulations under there. We have our Chapter 102, which is our erosion and sedimentation. That's for agriculture. There also is Construction 102. For agriculture, it's pretty much you need to have an Ag E&S plan or a conservation plan. We have our Chapter 105, which is water obstructions and encroachments. Chapter 275, the biosolids program. Chapter 91, manure management. And then Chapter 92, the concentrated animal feeding operations. Also, then we have Act 38 of 2005. That's our nutrient management program. We also brought in facility odor management in that in 2005. That was all part of the ACRE initiative. And then we have the Pennsylvania Invasive Species Act. We have local ordinances. We have our right to farm law in Pennsylvania and our right to know law in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to turn it over to Kate now, and Kate, I can advance your slides for you.
Sounds good, Frank. Thank you. Again, I'm Kate Breesall. I am our group manager for our ag compliance section at DEP. I appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you here about some of the work that we do and some of the regulations that we have the obligation and authority to enforce. So let's just dive in here to the Clean Water Act. Next slide there, Frank. So some of our programs, we do have the legal authority. Our legal authority is derived from the Federal Clean Water Act, which was enacted in 1972. It made it unlawful to discharge any pollutant from a point source to navigable waters unless a permit was obtained. And as Frank mentioned, EPA's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit program, that program controls those discharges. And animal feeding operations that meet the regulatory definition of a concentrated animal feeding operation, or CAFO, as Frank had mentioned, are regulated under that NPDES permitting program. And as he had mentioned, these are farms that are over 1,000 AEUs, or CAOs that are over 300 AEUs, or it's a farm that meets or exceeds EPA's headcount numbers. So, and this is by animal type: 700 dairy cows, 1,000 cattle, 55,000 turkeys, and there's a whole list by animal type that you can look up and to determine if it's a CAFO. And the NPDES permitting and inspection authority is delegated to DEP from EPA. And this includes CAFOs, but it also includes construction stormwater permitting for projects that are greater than or equal to an acre of earth's disturbance. So you might run into that as well when you're working with new or expanding operations. Next one there, Frank. And then our Clean Streams Law. So next one. And as you see here, this was actually enacted in 1937. So Pennsylvania was thinking about water quality even before the feds were at this. So 1972 for the Clean Water Act, and then 1937 for the Clean Streams Law. And it regulates any discharge that may cause or contribute to pollution of waters of the Commonwealth. It also establishes the Commonwealth's authority to protect streams from pollution for the benefit of Pennsylvania citizens and the environment. And this is where you find your Act 38 regs, as well as regulations related to erosion and sediment control, polluted runoff, including manure, stream obstructions and encroachments, and biosolids. And many of the operations that you're going to be working with through the planning process or BMP implementation will need to consider these regulations as part of their management strategies. Next one there, Frank. So chapter 102 and the next one, as Frank mentioned, this is Pennsylvania's erosion and sediment control regulations, and this is specifically chapter 102.4 of the Clean Streams Law. 102.4b relates to construction activities, but are still relevant to agricultural operations when they're proposing any earth disturbance other than plowing or tilling activities or animal heavy use areas. So again, here think new or expanding operation, new manure storage, new animal housing, stuff like that. 102.4a is specific to agricultural activities. This includes any operation with plowable or tillable land, including no-till, as well as any operation with animal heavy use areas. When I say animal heavy use areas, you might also think of the term any animal concentration areas. Animal heavy use areas is the term that we use under Chapter 102, and animal concentration area is the term that we use under Chapter 91, which we'll cover here in a minute. But essentially, they're both the same area. Think bare lot, any area where because of animal traffic, grass or dense vegetation cannot be maintained. A barnyard, a feedlot, a loafing area, places like that. But it does not include barn entrances or walkways. So 102.4a requires that all operations with combined areas of greater than or equal to 5,000 square foot of earth disturbance related to agricultural activities have a written Ag E&S plan and BMP implementation to minimize accelerated erosion and sedimentation. Below 5,000 square feet, the operation still needs to have BMPs in place. The BMPs just don't have to be written down in a written plan. Next one there. So what should be addressed in an Ag E&S plan? The Ag E&S plan will need to identify and have BMPs that address sheet and rill erosion, so it meets T over the rotation. Hopefully by the end of this boot camp, you understand what T is, but it's addressing sheet and rill erosion. And then also concentrated flow erosion, so think gullies here, and then erosion from animal heavy use areas as it is applicable. As long as the NRCS conservation plan addresses these concerns, it can be used to satisfy the Ag E&S planning requirements under Chapter 102. As a reminder, the purpose of these regulations is to protect waters of the Commonwealth from accelerated erosion and sedimentation. So you might find BMPs in these plans that are specific to nutrient management, like waste storage facilities or nutrient management, stuff like that. It does not have to be in the plan, though, to meet the Ag E&S requirements. So just like to make that note when we're talking about Ag E&S. So here, for more information about Ag E&S, you can check out our webpage referenced here. And we also have a soil erosion and sediment control manual for ag operations, which is our Ag E&S guidance, and that's linked here on this slide. Next one. We also have a course on the Clean Water Academy that is actually open to anyone who's interested. You don't have to have a login to log into it. It covers the Ag Erosion and Sediment Control Manual and the associated regulations. It clarifies what is in the manual and walks owners and operators and planners, plan developers through the process of completing an Ag E&S plan. It's actually an excellent follow-up after the introduction that we talk about today. But if you have a login, I do recommend that you use it. So if you're a conservation district employee or a DEP employee, please use that just so you can track your learning. Next one, Frank. And we also have a conservation, this is specific for conservation districts. It's a new Train the Trainer course specific to Ag E&S modeled, and it's modeled after our manure management plan Train the Trainer series. This is something that for conservation districts that are hoping to provide Ag E&S plan writing workshop or agricultural operations or consultants. Next one there. All right, Chapter 105. Next one. So you'll find these regulations, and they're related to water obstructions and encroachments in Chapter 105 of the Pennsylvania Clean Streams Law. And the objective of these regulations are to prevent unreasonable interference with water flow from in-stream construction activities. I included this here because if you're working with operations to implement their plans, you're going to likely run into scenarios when a 105 general permit will be necessary. Like if you're putting in a stream crossing, if you're putting in a rock-lined outlet to a waterway into a stream, those are going to require general permits. And general permits are typically small in scope with a simple design, and the permit provisions are pre-approved by DEP. But federal regulations may apply to larger projects. If you're implementing these BMPs, just understand that these permits can take some time. So plan that into your into your project timeline, and especially if there are some that are going to require a notification from PA Fish and Boat Commission. So again, just plan that into your timeline as you're working to implement these BMPs that are going to require permits. Next one there, Frank. And just kind of going into GPs, these are DEP approved permits where an applicant registers to utilize the permit. Again, they're small in scope, and the permit provisions are pre-approved by DEP. So the use of the GEP may be waived in some circumstances, and you can kind of look at the regulations for details on waivers, but the activity is still regulated, but a Chapter 105 permit is waived, and a waiver may be issued by DEP. The waiver may not be issued if DEP determines that the project may have significant impacts to the project area or an environment. All right, next one, Frank. And these are just some planning considerations around Chapter 105. The producer should have an Ag E&S plan, as we described in the 102 section, if it's applicable, and make sure that you're having conversations about the permit and the permitting process with the producer during the conservation or Ag E&S planning process. Next one. And these are just a list of common GPs that that may be associated with projects that you're helping to implement as part of your conservation work. And when I was out in the field, I was using a lot of the GP4. So these are your any kind of intake or outfall structures, the rockline waterway, like I mentioned, to the stream. If there's a stream crossing, that's going to be your GP6, stuff like that. And this slide is just kind of restating what I just said, so we can go to the next one. And you can find all of the required forms and documents associated with 105 GPs at the link on this slide. And just note again, like was mentioned earlier, construction activities cannot proceed until approval or acknowledgement is received from DEP or a delegated conservation district. Each permit has specific list of conditions where the GP does not apply. An approved permit must be on site during the construction activities. Next one. And you're just more information on 105. You can follow the breadcrumbs here. And then joint permits for obstruction and encroachments joint permits are for obstructions and encroachments that do not qualify for a waiver or a GP. Again, these are generally small projects with insignificant impacts. Next one. I'm not going to say a lot here about joint permits other than that there is a joint permit review by DEP and the U.S. Army Corps, and you can find more information here by following the breadcrumbs. Next one. All right, Chapter 275, this is biosolids. The application of biosolids is regulated under Chapter 275 of the Clean Streams Law. Facilities producing biosolids must obtain a permit in order to land apply biosolids, and they must be applied according to a nutrient or manure management plan. There are specific setbacks and management practices associated with the application of biosolids, and for more information here, you can check out the information on this slide. And animal operations. So I'm going to specifically talk about manure management and the non-CAOs and the non-CAFOs here in this section. So all farms or entities in Pennsylvania that land apply manure or agricultural wastewater must meet some level of state requirements. This is regardless of size. A very small, like a very, quite literally a one pony operation to very large 120,000 broiler operation. So regardless of the manure origin, this includes operations without livestock or poultry. Manure, if the manure is imported to the operation, they still need a manure management plan. And this is regardless of application type, if it's mechanically applied or directly applied by animals on pasture. Next one there, Frank. And you can kind of page to the end there. And this is kind of a review of the slide that Frank mentioned, but we have three main categories where we think about agricultural operations: our CAFOs, our CAOs, and our animal operations that are fully encompass both of those operations. And you don't have to remember that off the top of your head if as you're assisting the agricultural operator. This flow chart, and we do link it here, explains it very well. This is a good one to keep on the wall, on your cubicle wall if you're in your office. And then go to the next one there. Chapter 91. Chapter 91.36a covers the design and construction criteria for manure storages. The main points here are manure storages should be constructed to prevent pollution of surface and groundwater, including designed to prevent discharges during at least a 25 or 24-hour storm. If constructed to meet the current standards of the PA Technical Guide, or as Frank mentions, the EFOTOG, the storage meets that requirement. Here again, we'll spend so also there's a requirement for liquid and semi-solid manure storages that were constructed after January of 2000 to be certified by a professional engineer. And there's also freeboard requirements associated with manure storages. And then Chapter 91.36b says that operations that land apply animal manure or process or ag process wastewater. This is things like milk house wastewater, egg wash water, stuff like that. Must have and implement a written manure management plan in accordance with the manure management manual. And this is regardless of if that manure is mechanically applied or directly applied by livestock or poultry. And the manure management manual plan guidance here can be found in the link on this slide. So the manure management plan has to be a written plan. It can be developed by the farmer or other non-certified individual. It must use the standard format and worksheets in the manure management manual, unless there is an alternative that is approved by DEP. Plans do not need to be submitted for approval, but they must be available on site to DEP or Conservation District staff on request for inspection. This includes more than just manure application rates. It's setbacks, it's what to do in the wintertime when you're applying manure, manure storage and stacking area management, pasture management, how the operator is managing any kind of animal concentration areas. And there is record keeping requirement to the manure management plan. So those should be on site as well. And Going to the next one here, there's a couple places you can look for the manure management information on the Nutrient Management Manure Management Program site, which is administered by Penn State Extension, or by following the breadcrumbs here on our slide. And then 92A. This is a flowchart that's a quick and easy reference for citing EPA's headcount numbers, which we've been talking about, and all other conditions that would make an operation a CAFO. This is another really good one to keep in your office, hanging on your walls, and the link there is no longer on the slide, so I apologize for that, but I can find that for you and I'll put it in the chat. Again, CAFOs are regulated by DEP as delegated by EPA, and we have over 450 CAFOs in Pennsylvania. Each of these requires an NPDES permit from DEP, and this can be an individual or general permit depending on the conditions of the operation. The permit is reviewed by DEP and it's publicly noticed for 30 days. There are additional requirements for manure storages, record keeping, and reporting for CAFOs. And these operations need to have an Act 38 nutrient management plan that is reviewed and approved by the Conservation District or the State Conservation Commission, and an Ag E&S plan on all applicable acres. DEP inspects these operations at least once every 5 years, and the State Conservation District or State Conservation Commission or the Conservation District conducts status reviews on these operations annually. And next one, Frank. And this is another good one to keep on your wall. It demonstrates the water quality management permit, when a water quality management permit would be needed, and it can be found on the link on this slide. In short, water quality management permits are required on new or expanded liquid or semi-solid manure storage facilities located on an animal operation with over 1,000 AEUs for the first time after January 29th, 2000. New or expanded liquid or semi-solid manure storages constructed after October 25th, 2005. And where the storage is between 1 million and 2.5 million gallon capacity, and that storage is a pond that meets one of the two conditions here, which is a special protection watershed, or the water in a watershed impaired from nutrients by agricultural sources. And all liquid or semi-solid storages of 2.5 million gallons or more. Also of note here, as of 2000, all newly built liquid and semi-solid manure storages must be designed by a Pennsylvania registered professional engineer, and construction must be signed off by the engineer, and certification must be kept on site. So an individual permit applies to special protection watersheds, and general permit applies to existing new CAFOs not in special protection watersheds. All right, next one. And if you'd like more information on CAFOs, just take a look at this breadcrumbs on this slide too. I think this is where I hand it over to you, Frank.
Yep, thank you, Kate. Appreciate that. So next thing we're going to get into is our Act 38 program. That is the nutrient management program. And the objective of this program, and again, it was mentioned earlier today that the first law, which was Act 6, was enacted in 1993 in Pennsylvania. And then the first regulation from that law came out in 1997. Those regulations were revised as part of the Acre Initiative in 2005. And really, two things that changed in our nutrient management at that point was we needed to look at phosphorus, and we needed to close the loophole of exported manure not being planned, which we have done. But really, the objective of the nutrient management program and the objective of everything that Kate has talked about is to preserve water quality. The Act 38 program does create nutrient management planning standards for certain agricultural operations. We've talked about the different sizes. It requires the development of a nutrient management plan or a nutrient balance sheet. Nutrient balance sheets are used for the exported manure. It's administered by the State Conservation Commission. We do delegate our authorities to county conservation districts. and they review and approve nutrient management plans within their county, as well as do status reviews and other compliance type actions. But the commission does do the enforcement. So what is a nutrient management plan? And it IDs the nutrient sources on the farm. It determines the application rates and how you're going to apply that manure and any restrictions such as setbacks from water bodies or wells. It describes how you're going to handle excess manure. Are you going to be brokering it? Or are you going to be sending it to other ag operations for manure application? Or are you using it for some other method such as compost? Excuse me, it identifies any best management practices that may be needed on the farm. And really important is that it has to be consistent with conservation plan activities. So the last thing we want to see is a conservation plan that says that you're going to do no-tilling, or an Ag E&S plan that says you're going to do all no-till, and a nutrient management plan that says you're going to incorporate the manure within 3 to 5 days. Those two plans contradict each other, and we really don't want to see that. All these plans, again, are water quality-based plans, resource management plans, and they should correlate. Then we have nutrient balance sheets. Again, this was for manure for it that's going to importing farms. So the balance sheet is really just a simplified nutrient management plan. It determines the manure application rates on the importing farm, and the application rates really focus on the crop nutrient needs. Again, not to belittle any time, here are some links to different websites. Really importantly, we have our nutrient management program website that's hosted by Penn State through a contract we have with them for education. And it's really, really good website. It has all the different fact sheets that Penn State has developed, all the charts that we showed you earlier. Is my operation a CAFO? What type of plan do I need? That is all available for download on the program website. Another really good document that we have on there lists all the different programs and the sensitive areas and what those different programs may require for setbacks. So a wealth of information on that website. We also have our odor management program that was brought in 2005. And part of what the odor management program is looking to do is address the potential for impacts from off-site mitigation of odors from animal housing and manure storage facilities. Again, odor management plans are only needed for CAFOs and CAOs that plan to build new animal housing facilities or new manure storage facilities. It's not an air quality program. It's based off of odor. So we don't look at parts per, or we do not look at P2 or, oh gosh, we don't look at air quality on that. We just look at odors. To note that odors from the land application of manure are not addressed under Act 38. We get lots of questions, lots of complaints. And the first thing we have to ask, well, are they spreading manure? And if they're spreading manure, there's nothing we can do. Yeah, there's going to be odors. It's really nothing we can address. So odor management program, it establishes the planning and implementation criteria for odor management plans. And the odor management plan is site specific that assesses and addresses potential odor impacts, again, from the new animal housing or new manure storage facilities. We use an odor site index where we locate houses that may be homes and businesses and public use facilities that may be impacted from odor. And depending on the score from that, it leads us to the best management practices that may need to be employed on that farm. And we don't require you to completely eliminate odors. We know that you can't completely eliminate odors. So we're just looking to mitigate the source of odors for neighboring facilities. Again, we already talked about this. Existing facilities in manure application are not affected. The plans are reviewed and approved by the State Conservation Commission prior to construction of the new animal housing or new manure storage facility. We do not delegate our odor management program to the conservation districts. for several different reasons, but probably the most is that some counties will never have an odor management plan. Some counties will have one or two, and Lancaster County will have 200, 300. So there's really not there's not a level playing field amongst all the conservation districts. So that's why we just keep it in-house at the State Conservation Commission. And we require that your odor management plan be implemented prior to you using the facility. So you need to have your best management practices in place. Just a note that the odor management plan and the nutrient management plan should be developed, and implementation should be coordinated for the maximum benefit to the ag operation. So the odor management plan, nutrient management plan, they need to say the same things. They need to correlate with each other, just like the nutrient management plan and the ag E&S or conservation plan need to correlate with each other. And again, here are some more information for our odor management program. You can reach any commission staff, or Carl Diamond is our odor management plan coordinator. So now we're kind of out of State Conservation Commission rules and regulations and getting into the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, where we have Pennsylvania Invasive Species Act, local ordinances, right to farm, and right to know. So the Pennsylvania invasive species, an invasive species is anything that's non-native or exotic that is not indigenous to the ecosystem, whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm. There are national as well as state invasive species councils. They are charged with the development of invasive species management plans for detection, identification, control, both aquatic and terrestrial. There's the National Invasive Species Council, and in Pennsylvania, we have our governor's Invasive Species Council. We have our PA noxious weed control law. It gives the authority to the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, and it's illegal to propagate, sell, or transport noxious weeds that are on the noxious weed list. Some of the more common noxious weeds that you'll see is Canadian thistle, multifloral rose, myelobinnet, giant hogweed, tree of heaven. Tree of heaven is really bad with it's the host or one of the hosts for the spotted lanternfly, which is an invasive species. And if you're in the eastern part of Pennsylvania and central part of Pennsylvania, you know what that spotted lanternfly looks like, and the measures we're taking to try to control that. Again, the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture is in charge of these special noxious weeds infestations, as well as Penn State, their county cooperative extension offices, really assist us for ID and control recommendations for those noxious weeds. And then there's the websites for more information. Part of Act 38 of 2005, and it was part of Act 6 before that, controls local nutrient and odor management ordinances. So this was one of the major priorities of the acre legislation that came through. And it pretty much states that a municipal water quality regulation cannot be more stringent than the Act 38 regulations. You can do a local ordinance up to Act 38, but you can't go above the requirements of Act 38. Storage, handling, and use of manure and fertilizer, again, that is covered under the Act 38 program, as well as the location, construction, and operation of any manure storage facilities. Non-nutrient or non-odor management ordinances are not affected, so we don't have to worry about them. It's only when we're talking about nutrient, manure, or odor management. And a nice thing underneath or under the umbrella of Acre and Act 38 is that a farmer can challenge a local ordinance through a request to the Attorney General's office. So if a township has an ordinance already in place, or they enact a new ordinance, and a farmer believes that it is above and beyond the state requirement, they can send a written request to the Attorney General's office to review that local ordinance. And the Attorney General's office will work with the local township or municipality, take a look at the ordinance, and they try to work with that township to rectify that ordinance to make it into compliance with Act 38. So it is used quite often. The last I had looked, which was like maybe 2 years ago, the Attorney General's office was up over 100 requests for review. Some of the requests for review get denied, but most of them do get reviewed. And the Attorney General's office works with the municipality. They don't want to go to court. They try to work with the municipality to change the regulation, the local regulation, to make it work. We have had one case that I'm aware of since I've been here that went the whole way to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court upheld the Act 38 law and our preemption of local ordinances. So that was a win for the program and a win for agriculture. We have the right to farm law, and that the right to farm law limits the establishment of agricultural nuisance suits and ordinances. So what the right to farm law says is that nothing can be in conflict with normal, customary, or generally accepted farming activities. It excludes farms from public nuisance ordinances unless there's a direct adverse effect on public health or safety. It protects farmers from nuisance actions. It does not restrict rights to recover damages by a neighbor, but it does protect the farmer from frivolous lawsuits. It provides farmers with an inexpensive method to challenge local ordinances. Again, we talked about that earlier on how to petition the Attorney General. And you will find more information at these web links below. We have our right to know law. And in Pennsylvania, we have a very, 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 very strong right to know law. When we talk with our neighboring states, and the information that they can have at their disposal on agricultural operations, we cannot have the same information because it would be available under our right to know. So it provides citizens of Pennsylvania the right to access for public records. It determines what documents are deemed a public record. Certain records maintained by conservation districts are subject to public access, such as Ag E&S plan, manure management plan, nutrient management plans, odor management plans. Those are all available under right to know. You just need to submit a request and we'll produce the documents to us. We only are required to present the documents that exist or in our possession. One of the reasons that the nutrient management plans are held at county conservation districts versus the state is if we do not have the plans, we cannot produce them. Back early in the program, we had some environmental groups that wanted to see every nutrient management plan in Pennsylvania. I don't have those plans. So we told them, hey, you need to go to each county conservation district individually. At that point, they're like, oh, that's too much work. They dropped it. So there are some methods to the madness on what we do, and that's trying to protect or make data more difficult to get, although we're not hiding it from anybody. If we have it, we will provide it. It provides access and a response process, the how and when to handle a right to know request. That's all in the right to know law. And again, if you're in a conservation district, you need to check with your agency or your employer on their public access policy. Every conservation district and government agency should have one, or state government agency. And as Dan talked about earlier, certain records are protected by Section 1619 of the Food Conservation and Energy Act of 2008. So Pennsylvania's right to know law does not necessarily translate to local NRCS offices or the state NRCS office. because you have some federal laws that outweigh the state law. So we do have a quiz. I was not as handy as Dan, and I did not create a poll. But what I'll ask you to do is to speak up as we go through this quiz, or we can put it in the chat. I'll just have to pull up the chat here to take a look at it. So first part of the quiz, when would an Ag E&S plan be required? Multiple choice. Then you have you have 3 true or false questions. Only CAOs and CAFOs are regulated. With regard to Chapter 105, construction activities cannot proceed until approval or acknowledgement is received from DEP or the Delegated Conservation District. And then true or false, a local ordinance may be more stringent than the Act 38 requirements. So let me stop sharing so I can see the chats.
Let's see, maybe could you put the quiz back up?
Yes, I'm sorry. There we go. Can you guys see it all?
I'm not
Yeah.
seeing it yet.
Hold on a second. I stopped presenting. Hold on. Give me a second. I should have did what Dan did. Okay, can you see the quiz now?
Yes.
Good. Now you probably can't see it because I put the chat box up over top.
Nope, I can see it.
Okay, good, good. Well, just because I'm standing in your way before lunch, I will go ahead and provide the answers. When would an Ag E&S plan be required? An operation that practices continuous no-till, an operation that practices tillage, operation that has animals that cause earth disturbance equal to or greater than 5,000 square feet, or all of the above. And the answer is all of the above. True or false, only CAOs and CAFOs are regulated. That would be false. That is a statement we hear all the time, but all animal operations, anybody that has manure or utilizes manure is regulated. Most people only think of the nutrient management program for our CAOs and our CAFOs. They don't realize that under Chapter 91, which is a regulation, everybody needs to have a manure management manual. So we hear several times, oh, are regulated and non-regulated farms. That's not the case. All of our farms are regulated. True or false with regard to Chapter 105, construction activities cannot proceed until the approval or acknowledgement is received from DEP or the Delegated Conservation District. Kate, I say true. Am I correct? I believe that is true.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah, that's true.
Thank you. I just wanted to confirm. And then true or false, a local ordinance may be more stringent than Act 38 requirements, and that is false. So with that, our contact information is at the end. You can always contact me, and I will direct you to the appropriate person, or reach out to my regional coordinators or your conservation district field reps. The conservation partnership is strong. We really work well together. It's an amazing thing that was established a long time ago and continues to run flawlessly. We have our disagreements from time to time, but all in all, the conservation partnership is wonderful. It does lots of great work, and you have agencies that speak on a regular agency, and I don't really think that happens a lot in state and federal government. So it's really good. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Yuri.
Okay, Frank, there was one question earlier on. Are there different certifications for plan writers to be able to write ENS plans for 102.4 versus 102.4A versus 102.4B?
There is no, and this is for Kate. Kate, you can
I can I
chime
can take
in.
it. Yeah. There's no certification requirement for either for either construction or ag. For anything under 102, you just have to be a qualified individual to write that plan, which is why we have that ag ENS planning training kind of open to the public, because it can be written by a farmer if it makes sense for that operation.
All right. Thank you, Kate. And I saw that you put links to all the flow charts and such that people were requesting. So
Yep,
those
yep.
are the links are in the chat. And I totally agree with you, Frank, that I think the PA partnerships are really, really great, very strong. Thank you so much for that rundown on the state regs. And there was a question if the presentations will be provided, and I believe that they will be provided electronically if they weren't already. Let's see, maybe we can get a better answer to that later on. Let's see. So we're going to take a break now. Let's go ahead and take the full 15 minutes. So we're gonna be running just a little bit behind, but I think the last two presentations before lunch are pretty packed. So let's take our full 15 minutes now. So get up and stretch, and we'll be back at 10:30. Is that wait, first before you leave, is that okay, Peter Hoagland? You're our next presenter. Do you mind going a little bit later? Okay.
Absolutely. That's totally fine. Thanks, Jerry.
Okay, good. All right, so we'll see you all back at 10:30 sharp.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you, Frank and Kate. Hey, 10:30 and Peter's on. All right. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. You've heard from our dignitaries. You've heard all about the federal and state and local regulations. And so now we finally get into the fun part, the technical stuff, the stuff that probably why you all are in the careers you are, where you get to learn about forests and soils and engineering practices and pasture and plant ID and all that good stuff. So our next speaker is Peter Hoagland. He's the NRCS State Forester based in Harrisburg. And take it away, Peter.
Thank you, Yuri. And I will show my screen very briefly and say hello to everybody, give myself a little introduction. Like Yuri said, I'm the State Forester for NRCS. Been in this position for about 7 years. And before I bounced around to a bunch of other positions, position with NRCS in California, positions with the Bureau of Land Management and with the U.S. Forest Service. So happy to be here with you guys today and share a little bit about forestry. I'm going to turn off my camera and jump into the presentation. Okay, so here's my objectives for the presentation today. We're going to talk a little bit about Pennsylvania's forests, our history of forestry. We're going to talk about forestry-related conservation practices, resource concerns, and a little bit about forestry roles, how it works within the conservation partnership in Pennsylvania. But before we get into that, I want to open it up for a little bit of interaction because most of you are here because you need to attend this training as a prerequisite to becoming a conservation planner. And I'd hope that if if that's what you're going to do as part of your position, that you want to be effective at it, right? So so I'd like to open it up and hear some of your thoughts on what are some of the traits of an effective conservation planner. You can feel free to type something out in the chat box, or if you're brazen enough to go off mute, that's fine too. I have some thoughts on this that are kind of hidden right now, but if you have some thoughts on what an effective conservation planner is, please throw something in the chat. And I will do my best to manage the awkward silences. Seeing nothing in the chat. I'm seeing that you guys are here to learn about being an effective conservation planner. Good communication skills, being a good listener, good. Getting some feedback now in the chat about good communication. Yeah, that's something that we don't learn about in ag and natural resources school enough. Someone who learns about forestry. Yeah, thanks, Dan. Personable, empathetic. That's great. Yeah, being able to interact with your clients. An objective view of the total operation, having good communication skills, detail-oriented, long-term planning minded, considers plans holistically. Good feedback there. Good note-taking. Yeah, if you don't write it down, it didn't happen, right? All right, so here are some of the things that I think about, developing a relationship with your customers, learning how they operate, understanding that each operation is unique. Learn who your partners are, not just your clients, but your partners. Learn what they have to offer, like we've been talking about with this conservation partnership. How they can help you and your customers. You don't have to know everything. You do need to know who your partners are, though. Look for ways to expand the partnership. You got to know the details. You got to know your soils, your flora, your fauna, the communities in your local area and your region. You got to be able to talk knowledgeably with your customers. And you got to understand, at least for conservation planning, you got to understand the resource concerns, be able to identify the resource concerns, and understand the conservation practices and address those resource concerns, and also alternatives. and keep up with the latest technology, research, natural resource related issues, whether that be invasive plants, invasive insects, what's going on with water quality, what's going on with laws and regulations. A lot of information that you're going to be gathering today or have already heard about today with some of our previous presenters. So let's jump into it. Now you're thinking, wait, come on, forestry. And yes, we're going to talk about forestry for briefly. I know that this is actually called agricultural conservation technical training, but you're right. For right now, that's what it's called, the training until I can convince Dan to change the name of this training. But we're going to talk a little bit about forestry because it is a component of what we do as a natural resource community. It's a component of what NRCS does, and forest land is equally important to the other land uses. And I could be forgiven for arguing that forestry is actually the most important topic because it is the predominant land use in Pennsylvania. I know that others would argue the opposite of that. But so forestry conservation incorporates management activities in order to achieve conservation outcomes, desired conditions, and a whole host of benefits, a number of benefits. Now you're thinking, well, what are those benefits? And I'd like for you guys to tell me, without looking at the copy of the slides. I don't think you have the slides yet. Please feel free to throw something in the chat. Announce a benefit that you see from Pennsylvania's forest management. Seen anything yet, but think about some of those benefits that we talk about in agricultural settings and also forestry. So erosion control, reduction of invasive species pressure, good. Improved habitat for flora and fauna, wildlife habitat. Yeah, there's a lot of focus on wildlife habitat in forestry operations. Improved water quality, benefits to ecological processes. Excellent. Yeah, we're getting some good feedback there. All right, let me see if I can. Ooh, carbon sequestration. That's a big topic right now, huh? All right, here's some of the conservation benefits that we're talking about. Some of you guys touched on that, and they're still getting some comments in, like biomass harvest, healthy regeneration, carbon credits. So here's some of those conservation benefits: wildlife habitat, biodiversity, water quality, restoration of damaged ecosystems, improved forest health, resilience to stressors like carbon sequestration. And then there's also landowner benefits. Some of you guys are touching on that, like resources for future generations, supplemental income, sustainable timber yield for forest products, recreation and hunting. There's investment opportunities. There's also, on the broader scale, Pennsylvania's forests contribute a huge amount to the Pennsylvania economy, upwards of $5 billion per year in the timber industry, as well as tens of thousands of jobs. So hugely important. So breaking it back down to the property level, everything starts with a plan, just like the other land uses. So for forests, a forest management plan is how we start. And this is really a site-specific plan which addresses one or more resource concerns, recommends conservation activities based on inventory to achieve the desired future conditions. Forest management plan can be any one of these different plans. It can also include a forest stewardship plan, which is a program run by the U.S. Forest Service and delegated to the State Bureau of Forestry, so Pennsylvania Bureau of Forestry. It can be a tree farm plan that meets the National Tree Farm program. Or it can also be a NRCS forest management plan or other plan meeting NRCS criteria that's been approved by the state conservationist. So that can be plans written externally by organizations like the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. And there's other organizations out there that are writing forest management plans too. So why would a client want to get a forest management plan? Well, obviously it's a valuable tool because they can work to implement their plan, maybe get some financial assistance, but we're not really talking about financial assistance today. It is really to help them organize their plan of action, come up with a strategy to address the existing conditions and also their objectives, to put together that plan of action down on a piece of paper and help them kind of steer their conservation on the site. So a forest management plan has some kind of 6 general components. It really assesses the existing conditions, makes a management recommendation or a schedule of operations, and looks at the desired future conditions, how we're going to get to that future state on the site. So how's that become your responsibility? Well, you know, as a conservation planner, you have to have that basic familiarity with the types of plans. And we're not just talking about forestry. We're talking about, you know, all the Ag E&S plans, you know, everything that was covered in the previous presentation. But for forestry, you know, you're not going to be writing a forest management plan, but you will probably see some forest management plans, and you need to have some familiarity with what's going to be in those forest management plans, familiarity with commonly utilized forestry practices and forestry terminology, as well as becoming familiar with associated materials and things that are necessary to add on for conservation practices into a conservation plan for a client. And that's what we're going to try and cover a little bit more in depth today. So we do have a pretty broad definition of what forest is. So forestry, the forest land use, this includes areas that are at least 10% stocked, which looks like 25% or greater canopy cover. I think I've got this little laser pointer here. I think kind of in between these 2 charts, if the black spots are canopy cover. And forest has to be a minimum of 1 acre, must be at least 100 feet wide, but it can also include land bearing evidence of natural regeneration of tree cover and is not currently developed for any sort of other non-forest use. So that can be things like abandoned pastures, abandoned cropland that's reverting to forest land. It can also be things like abandoned mine land that was previously forested prior to mining operations. So let's look back, look at Pennsylvania's forests from a wider scope here. Like I said, predominant land use in Pennsylvania covers about 58% of Pennsylvania. There's about 11.7 million acres of private forest lands in Pennsylvania, owned by about 738,000 private forest landowners. And there are about 4.8 million acres of public lands. That's U.S. Forest Service lands, Pennsylvania Game Commission, Bureau of Forest, state parks, and state forest lands. And it's an enormous industry in Pennsylvania. This is what forest ownership looks like across Pennsylvania. And if you notice on here, the darker green is forested areas. The orange is public lands, and then other land uses like ag land is in yellow. So obviously there's forest land in every county of the state, but you'll notice that there is considerably less in the southeastern counties due to, you know, ag land and development pressure. This is what forests look like, and it varies across the state as much as ownership, but we do have 2 general types that are widespread across the regions in Pennsylvania. So in the northern tier, our forests are predominantly maple, beech, and birch forest types, and in the southern half of the state, it's largely oak and hickory forests. But there are other forest types mixed in. So it's also important to know the history of forestry in Pennsylvania to kind of understand how the current forests have been impacted by the past decisions. You know, at the time of European settlement, forests likely covered more than 90% of our state. And some species that we hardly ever see now were a major component, like American chestnut, which is now pretty much almost gone from our forests. And prior to commercial development that allowed for widespread timber harvest, a lot of the land was really cleared for agriculture. We look around the mid 1700s, there was some big industries like the iron industry that put demand on timber supply for the creation of charcoal. It is estimated that about 3.5 million acres of Pennsylvania's forests were cut to feed the iron industry. There was also some demand for specific species, like in the 1840s and 50s, white pine was in demand for ship masts. There were other industries that put demands on the state timber resources, such as the leather tanning industry, wood chemical businesses, potash production, and eventually, you know, there was pretty much uncontrolled logging, and led to vastly depleted forests by the early 1900s. And there was excessive erosion, there was mudslides, there was even uncontrolled fires in cutover areas in Pennsylvania. This all was happening at the time where there was kind of a renewed focus on conservation in Pennsylvania. State forests were being formed with the Department of Forests in 1905. And this coincided with, you know, kind of a nationwide growing conservation and preservation movement across the country with key players like John Muir and Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot was obviously a governor of Pennsylvania, but he was the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service too. So here's another historical look. This forest, we're lucky to have these pictures. This forest was documented continuously since 1927, when this section of the Little Arnott Run on the Allegheny River was clear cut for saw timber. So looking at that 1927 picture, we can see kind of 1927 to 28 there. That's what the clear cut, when the clear cut occurred, excuse me. And since then, this forest has been left to develop naturally with very little disturbance. But it has continued to grow into an example of an even-aged forest that's been pretty much completely unmanaged. You'll notice in the 2008 picture and in the 2018 picture, the forest understory is now being overrun by invasive brush species. And then there was a silvicultural thinning of this forest in if there was a silvicultural thinning in this forest in 1958 or 1968 there, it would have dramatically increased the age class diversity and the average tree size of the forest in 2018. But that didn't happen, obviously. So the results of these past forest management practices, like this one that I just showed, is a typical forest age class distribution in Pennsylvania, which is even aged, meaning that the majority of the trees in the forest are about the same age, regardless of the size of the trees. So this places forests generally into what's called a stem exclusion phase, where the species distribution has shifted towards shade-tolerant species like red maple, and away from shade-intolerant species like red oak. So also pay attention on this graph that there is very little representation in the younger age classes. Over here, it's kind of fun. So the younger age classes are really not represented here on this graph, which is called natural regeneration. And this can be due to shading, which can limit the plant species which are able to get established, but it can also be impacts from deer browse, invasive plant species, invasive insects, and a lack of natural disturbance, including fire suppression, which is human-induced, a lack of disturbance. So this line that I placed on here is what we would normally want to see our forest looking like, as opposed to how the graph has broken it out here in that even aged forest. So this view is obviously a pretty normal view in Pennsylvania's Ridge and Valley physiogeographic province. You might even call it picturesque. But if you look a little closer, what we see here is a forest lacking age class diversity. So diverse age structure is really beneficial because trees are most vulnerable to specific stressors at different ages. So for example, droughts are typically more damaging to seedlings than to mature trees, whereas older individuals may be more susceptible to damage from wind events. Another impact to the health of our forest is a human-induced impact due to the non-sustainable practice of diameter limit cutting, also sometimes referred to as high grading. And this is where everything over a certain diameter is harvested, which often leaves behind really poorly formed trees and takes no consideration for regenerating the next forest. So I really want to reiterate that this is not an acceptable forestry practice, but it is one that is extremely common in Pennsylvania on private lands. And it should really be discouraged. This is not an acceptable forestry practice. This can often be referred to more accurately as cutting the best and leaving the rest. And it really focuses on short-term economic advantages and leads to the devaluation of timber quality and other ecological stressors. When seed sources for desirable species and good genetics are removed from a forest through diameter limit cutting, the result is often something like this picture. So Dr. Jim Finley recently passed away a couple of years ago, a retired Penn State professor, called situations like this a green lie, meaning that landowners might think that everything is fine because it's all green. And if you don't have a trained eye, maybe this is beautiful for some people. But if you look closer, this area is entirely made up of plants that are undesirable for markets or even for wildlife. And what remains is plants that interfere with the regeneration of the forest. So what do you see in this picture? I see ferns, and I see striped maple. An understory of ferns, probably hay-scented fern, and striped maple in the overstory. And these are species that are ecologically undesirable because they shade out the understory and limit the establishment of new seedlings as well as regeneration. So this picture is from a site where NRCS contracted a shelterwood cut to create early successional habitat. This site is now an uneven aged forest with more age class diversity as well as size class diversity and structural diversity for wildlife habitat. Those overstory tree species are likely oaks, and they're leaving some nesting and some roosting habitat for neotropical migratory birds. This is really the desirable habitat compared to something like this. So let's talk about resource concerns. We talked about the prevalent issue in our forests related to age class diversity, but there are also a host of other issues in our forest that can equate to NRCS resource concerns. And this presentation might be the first one that talks about resource concerns. So just as a background, a resource concern is the technical definition is a degradation of the soil, water, air, plant, or animal resource base to the extent that the sustainability or intended use of the resource is impaired. So in forest lands conservation planning, NRCS is usually dealing with plant condition related resource concerns, but it's not uncommon for there to also be other resource concerns identified on forest lands that might relate to wildlife habitat or soil erosion or water quality issues. But our ultimate goal with conservation is to address those resource concerns and make improvements that will deliver environmental benefits. Oops, went back. So plant productivity and health, this is one of our main resource concerns. And I should also note that each resource concern has something called planning criteria that are either quantitative or qualitative statements of the minimum level of treatment required to address a given resource concern. So there's planning criteria established for each and every resource concern that might be addressed by using specific tools or through client input or a combination of those things. So obviously the plant productivity and health can be limited by undesirable yet native species like hay-scented fern because of that overabundance and the fact that it's not allowing for any tree regeneration to occur on the site. Plant structure and composition, that's referring to the vegetative diversity on the site. A site that's a monoculture of one tree species will have little value to wildlife that requires a mix of species for habitat. Also, a monoculture site will really not be resilient to some of the diseases and insect infestations and competing invasive vegetation stressors in Pennsylvania's forests. And then stand structure refers to the physical arrangement of the vegetation in a forest stand. Generally, a stand with more structure has more habitat components for wildlife. So this resource concern looks at if the density, if the composition and the structure, if it represents a natural plant community. And there's obviously plant pest pressure as a resource concern. So in forests, we are primarily dealing with invasive and noxious plant species because they can put pressure on native and desirable species by stressing and outcompeting and even killing native species. So these impacts can alter plant communities, species diversity, composition, and structure of the forests. And we certainly have our fair share of invasive insect pests and disease species that are putting pressure on forests like spotted lanternfly that was mentioned earlier. There's a huge list. You know, we could talk about emerald ash borer, cherry scallop shell moth, spongy moth, used to be called gypsy moth, oak wilt, hemlock woolly adelgid, beech bark disease, beech leaf disease, walnut twig beetle, etc. We could go on. But NRCS practices tend to be kind of limited in what they can do to directly address insects and disease infestations because of the overlap in jurisdiction with another agency, the Animal Plant Health and Inspection Service, APHIS, and the fact that their practice standards are usually a little less static. And so we're usually dealing with plant pest pressure. But invasive species can also include non-native and invasive, as well as noxious plants that adversely impact habitat and biodiversity. And often it requires multiple treatments in order to gain adequate control to address those resource concerns. So here's just three of the bad ones, but there's a whole host of other ones. The Pennsylvania the Pennsylvania Control Plants and Noxious Weed Control Law was mentioned in the previous presentation. That was passed in 2017, and it's been amended several times since then to add in additional species. by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. But essentially, it breaks it down into Class A species and Class B species, as well as Class C species. But Class A are the species that are highest priority species, meaning that the state wants to prevent new infestations and eradicate existing infestations. Class B, essentially, the state wants to control the existing infestations from spreading significantly, and that they might require more control in certain cases. So also in Pennsylvania, there is a large list of invasive plants that's maintained by Pennsylvania DCNR, Bureau of Forestry. This is a non-regulatory list of species that are not native to the state, but are known to grow aggressively and spread widely, as well as displace native vegetation. So the main difference that you need to know is that the noxious weed list is a regulatory list under PDA. The invasive species list is a non-regulatory list, but there are some noxious species that will be listed on the invasive species list. Here's an interesting picture that's got, probably 4 or 5 different ones. Japanese stiltgrass, barberry, multiflora rose. I think there's some tree of heaven in the background. This is not uncommon to see in our forests at all. All right, so another resource concern that we're typically trying to address is terrestrial habitat for wildlife and invertebrates. So here is a golden wing warbler. It's one of the species that we have a focus on in particular areas of Pennsylvania. So for addressing this resource concern, we utilize what's called a wildlife habitat evaluation guide, which is looking at a series of questions to address, to assess, rather, on the connectivity of food, cover, space, shelter, if the site is adequate to meeting the resource needs of particular species, and also take a look at what is lacking from that habitat. All right, so we're kind of transitioning now, to address resource concerns. A forest management plan might recommend particular conservation practices and also identify prescriptions and acreages of treatments based on inventory to achieve those desired future conditions. So one of those key practices that is often included in a forest management plan is forest stand improvement. And I've included codes here. 666 is the NRCS code for forest stand improvement. So this can include things like changing species composition, the structure and tree density by cutting and killing different trees. This can include silvicultural activities like crop tree release, shelter wood cuts, patch cuts, forest openings. A whole host of different methods fall within one conservation practice. And suffice it to say that in advanced boot camp, we're going to go into more detail and specific silvicultural methods. But at this point, it's enough to say that there's not a one-size-fits-all treatment when it comes to implementing this practice and changing a forest. So in Pennsylvania, this conservation practice is also often employed to modify stand density to increase plant productivity, improve habitat, and also assist with rehabilitation of degraded stands where there has been like a high grade that occurred. Here's another shot almost immediately post-treatment after a forest stand improvement cut. So with this cut, you can kind of see how dense it was before, but this cut opened up the canopy, left behind some scattered large seed trees that will help to populate the understory and create a forest with multiple age classes. Here's another practice that's often utilized in forest land settings to help improve plant diversity and improve habitat. It's tree and shrub establishment, code 612. So tree planting provides a whole host of conservation benefits like soil protection, water and air quality improvement, and improvement to the species diversity on the site. It's also, obviously a carbon sequestration focused practice. Trees can pack on carbon, and it's for that reason it's a practice that's focused on for climate mitigation. But in Pennsylvania, we also include regeneration area protection fences under 612, under tree and shrub establishment. So that's often prescribed in areas that have had a silvicultural treatment in order to protect the regeneration of the trees on the site, so as to ensure, a successful establishment of the future forest. So this is maybe a little tricky to see, but right in here, there is an 8-foot fence. You can kind of see better evidence of it here, but silvicultural treatment occurred over here. None occurred over here. There is regeneration over here. There is none over here. It's a pretty clear-cut line, and that is just allowing the site to get reestablished with regeneration. Regeneration is baby trees on the site. Let them get up and out of a browse line, and let them get established. That is creating sites that have a greater diversity of age classes, as well as addressing some of those understory forest resource concerns where there is lack of age class in the younger age classes. Invasive species treatments, herbaceous weed treatment, 315, and brush management, 314. These are practices focusing on treating areas to improve site conditions for establishing forests by reducing competition from the understory species. This is an extremely common practice in forest lands, and often the main reason why a landowner is seeking assistance. So as a conservation planner, it's important to recognize the problematic species that we talked about earlier, and the likely need to control and the control treatments, as well as gauging the degree of infestation. So some species will require multiple treatments, which are often done with broad spectrum foliar and pre-emergent herbicides. However, if you are an NRCS employee, you do need to follow the pest management policy, which says that NRCS cannot recommend a specific pesticide or formulation. That is one of the policies, but often in the forest management plan, there will be specific pesticides or formulations included. Forest trails and landings. This is a conservation practice that is used to reduce erosion by installing like rolling dips or water bars on forest trails where there's gully erosion as a resource concern that's transporting sediments. Prescribed burning. This is really not a widespread practice in Pennsylvania due to the lack of available contractors, but it can be a really cost-effective practice to address forest health issues, as well as reducing invasive species. And it's something that we're trying to encourage and support through NRCS, and there are several partners working to support this as well, and increase the availability and landowners' ability to do this on their property. So there are also a host of what are called agroforestry practices. Riparian forest buffer is one of those. This is an agroforestry practice that is often reestablishing riparian vegetation along the streams, so as to reduce nutrients and sediments impacting water quality. Here's another agroforestry practice that's not done on forest lands. It's done on cropland. It's where agricultural crop is grown simultaneously with a long-term tree crop, which is why it's called alley cropping. to provide an annual income while the tree crop matures. So this is not done widespread in Pennsylvania, but it's something that we've supported through a conservation innovation grant, and there is some increasing demand. So this can be done with hardwoods like walnut or oak, which are favored species in alley cropping systems, and can potentially provide long-term resource concerns being addressed, as well as long-term income. And those nut crops can be another short-term intermediate product too. Multi-story cropping, there's another agroforestry practice. This is forest farming now. I should have changed this. The name just got changed. It's the cultivation of high-value specialty crops under the protection of forest canopy that provides, correct shade levels. So this is a practice that helps the landowner keep the forest as forest, but also creates opportunities for creating, in developing products in the understory, like shiitake mushrooms or golden seal or ramps or ginseng, things that are sold for medical or culinary or ornamental issues or uses. Lastly, I want to touch on windbreak and shelter belt establishment. These are linear plantings of trees and shrubs designed to enhance crop production and protect people and livestock and benefit soil and water conservation. So there are several types of windbreaks, like field windbreaks to protect a variety of wind-sensitive crops, control erosion, increase pollination and pesticide effectiveness. We're also doing windbreaks around poultry houses to aid in reducing odor as well as dust and providing, obviously visual and noise barriers. So I think I am almost out of time, but my last slide here, I just want to touch on forestry roles, how we see it. Obviously the client is the final decision maker. They are the signature on their own forest management plan. They're the person that chooses to implement the treatments on their own land. You guys, as conservation planners, you kind of aid in guiding the planning process, help develop the conservation plan with coordination with the client, with a forester from NRCS or a DCNR service forester, as well as the forestry professional. That can be a consultant or a technical service provider. The agency forester, that can be an NRCS forester, or in Pennsylvania, a DCNR service forester. That role is looking at quality assurance, reviewing the planned and implemented activities, and recommending practice certification. And the forestry professional, that is typically somebody who's a technical service provider or a consultant. They conduct the inventory, develop a forest management plan, recommend treatment alternatives. That person is usually different from a forestry contractor. That is the person that gets hired by a client to actually implement the treatments. But all this works together, in a nice little puzzle piece here to benefit the landowner and benefit the operation on the ground. And there is my contact information, as well as a really low intensity prescribed fire in the background. Most people don't think of it being, 3-inch flame lakes. All right, so I believe we have a poll. I'm going to try and launch this poll for you guys. All right. Here is your first poll.
Come on, folks. All right, here we go. We only have 17 responses so far. Keep the responses coming. I know we have at least 50 students. And while those are coming in, Peter, somebody in the chat posted that it's International Day of Forests and National Agricultural Day. And yeah, I figured out. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Peter.
I was just gonna say that sounds really cool, and I didn't know about that. So, how appropriate for conservation planners.
Okay, now the folks that I think the guests who maybe aren't in our USDA system may not be able to do the poll so well. So the
Okay.
question
All
is,
right. So
yeah. Do you
yeah,
want to read the
I'll
question?
just read it off. Sure.
Yeah. Yep.
So the poll question says, due to past management activities, Pennsylvania's forests are mostly considered A, uneven aged, B, even aged, C, multilateral, or D, oak and hickory. You could just type it in if you can't see the poll.
Yeah, go ahead and type it in. The choices are, yeah, uneven aged, A, B, even aged, C, multilateral, or D, oak and hickory.
I think you guys figured this one out mostly. The majority is saying, well, we got 33 responses on the poll and a handful in the chat, so awesome. The majority are saying even aged. And I think that is correct. The answer is even aged. Most of our forests were predominantly cut in the early 1900s, and what we've got out there right now is predominantly an even aged forest. And Paul, I don't know if I'm not seeing the second poll question. Are you able to launch the second poll question, Paul? There it goes. All right, second poll question is a true or false. True or false, diameter limit cutting is a beneficial and sustainable forestry conservation practice that can help improve resource concerns on a client's property. Okay, maybe this was an easy one. I hope it was an easy one. We are, if you take nothing else away from my presentation, please discourage landowners that you work with to get a plan. Don't diameter limit cut their property. All right, got a lot of responses in the chat and on the poll. So thank you guys so much for your attention, and please enjoy the rest of your training and think about forestry often. I will stop sharing, Yuri, and hand it back over to you. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I get to finish this up before lunch, and I am going to launch in. Let's see, I did create a quick poll just so I can get a handle on the folks, your all's experience with soil. So let me see if I can find my poll. Okay, here we go. Here is a poll. Let's see, is this launched? Yes. Okay, so for those of you who can't see the poll, how many soil courses have you taken? So the answer is none, 1, or 2 or more. So I'd like to see some of your all's responses. None, 1, or 2 or more, so I can get a handle on who I'm talking to here. chat up. Okay, I'm getting, wow, okay, this is great. So we do have a few folks that haven't had any soils. We've had over at least half that have had 2 or more. And we've had some that have had at least 1. Okay, so this is a kind of a wide range then, and I'm glad to know that about you all. So let me share my screen. Okay, make sure I got this screen mode. Okay, so what I've got here is we've given this presentation over a number of boot camps, and also what we found, the feedback I get from other folks and supervisors and such is that soils is something that planners can always use a little more training on, and it's of course the backbone of everything that we do is, and so this first presentation, Basic Soil Properties, is taking like a college level intro course and squeezing it down into 45 minutes. We don't cover everything. We don't cover soil physics or that sort of thing, but touch on almost everything else. Basics, physical properties, a little bit about soil chemistry, a little bit about soil geomorphology, soil forming factors, and erosion organic matter. So we're going to launch right in here. Okay, so basics. Soil is a mixture of minerals, organic matter, water, and air, and it's on the land's surface. It supports plants, microorganisms, and there are many different kinds of soils. And so we think about 5 critical functions normally for soils. So of course we grow our food, but the middle 3, the habitat, soils as a filter, and soils as recycling nutrients, are getting at this fact that soils are both biologically active and chemically active. So they're an ecosystem. A healthy soil is an ecosystem that is alive. And so it's a habitat, it's chemically active. And so both physical and chemical properties will filter the water we drink. And we have the recycling component of it. I tell 6th graders that take conservation field days that if it weren't for the microorganisms and soils, we would literally be drowning in our own garbage, because that's where all the decomposition happens. And then it's also the foundation. So like for engineers, they think of soils as something to construct on, something to manipulate and build. So all those different aspects of soils. So here's something, if you've taken your Soils 101, the soils formation. So there are unique types of soils that form because of 5 soil forming factors. So here's this an equation. Soil equals, it's a function of CLORPT. Any guesses? Type in the chat what any of those stand for. CLORPT. Let's see anything in the chat. Come on, folks. Ha, all right. Yes, O equals organic matter, parent material, climate. Yep, you've got 3 of those 5. Time, yes. And there's one other. What does the R stand for? You might not think of it as R. You might think of it as another type of T. All right, I will move on here. Okay, so here's the 5 soil forming factors. We have climate, which someone said. We had organisms, which someone said. We had parent material, we had time, and that 5th one is relief, landscapes, or topography. So the combination of those 5 things will give you distinct soils that are with characteristics that are repeatable and therefore mappable. All right, so breaking this down, so climate, of course, it's the rainfall, temperature that soil formed under. So soils tend to develop faster in warm, wetter climates. We're in a temperate climate, so our soils will form faster than those in slower, cold, or dry ones, because it all has to do with water, the movement of water, the temperature, the biological activity that's going on in the soil, freeze thaw, all those things contribute as part of climatic factors that contribute to soil development. And then organisms. So what kind of plants, animals, and microbiology live in that soil? So for example, with the organisms and vegetation, prairie soils that formed under our prairie grasslands will look very different than the hardwood temperate forest soils that we have here in Pennsylvania. So these prairie soils, you have these tall grass prairies with big roots, big fibrous root systems that are sending a lot of organic matter and carbon down into the soil profile. So you may get like 14, 20, 30-inch thick dark topsoil, or what we call A horizons. And in our temperate forest soils, you'll have a thinner A horizon that's formed from mostly leaf litter. And you have roots, but you have different kinds of roots. So it leads for a different kind of soil formed in here in Pennsylvania than, say, out in the Midwest. So what is parent material? Parent material are things like the geology. It's what that soil formed from. And parent material can be, so it can be rock, it can be recently deposited alluvium on floodplains and rivers, it can be glacial till, or it can be wind deposited materials called loess. Parent material can also be human transported. So it can be human transported fill. And so there's a whole new area of soil taxonomy that's devoted to anthropogenic soils as well. Topography that's also known as relief. So that is where in the landscape are you? So you have deeper soils formed at the bottom of the slope because you've had a lot of gravity working on material that's colluviated down the slope and accumulated at the bottom. And you may have shallower soils on the convex upper side slopes of a hill and everything in between. And then time is how long has that soil been stable in place, forming soil forming factors. So here's a glimpse of parent material, and I think I heard Peter Hoagland mention the Ridge and Valley in one of his slides. So here are the physiographic provinces of Pennsylvania, and you can see you have these glaciated areas in the northwest and the northeast. You have this big swatch in the middle. That's the Appalachian Mountain section. That's called the Ridge and Valley. On the southeast, you're in the Piedmont upland section. That's characterized by metamorphic, some igneous rocks. The very southeast corner is the Atlantic coastal plain. Those are coastal sediments that are now where geologic upheaval, now they are above ground. And in the western part is the same sedimentary rocks, layers of limestone, sandstone, siltstone, and shale, but they are flat-lying versus in this Ridge and Valley section in the middle where they are tilted on end. So it's really important, and you'll enjoy your job more and sound more knowledgeable if you are aware of where you are on this map when you're planning. Here's a little more about those two, the northeast and northwest sections that are glaciated, and each of those colors shows different glacial advancements. So these are all glacial till areas. And so some of our glacial till is maybe as young as 17,000 years old, and some of it may be several 100,000 years old. Whereas in the central part of Pennsylvania, some of our limestone soils, they think have been forming in place for millions and millions and millions of years, if you talk to some of the soil geomorphology professors at Penn State. So here's that landscape position or relief or topography. And so this is a lot like what our Pennsylvania landscapes look like. We have topography in Pennsylvania. We're not flatlands. So we'll have this upland area, we'll have our valleys, we'll have our floodplains, and where you are on that landscape will dictate certain soil characteristics that, like I said, are repeatable and mappable. So on your uplands where maybe it's fairly flat, you have water that's able to move down through the soil profile and freeze and thawing, and so you can have a fairly well-developed profile in your upland. And then down on your floodplain, you have a very weakly developed soil because those are new sediments, relatively speaking. Those were maybe deposited just in the last few hundred years. And so you haven't had a whole lot of time to develop soil characteristics in them. And then you have sort of moderately developed soils on your foot slopes and your lower side slopes. So these are all mappable. This is how soil scientists, soil geomorphologists look at the landscape. And you as a planner can look at the landscape like this too, and immediately have an idea of what you're going to find if you dig a hole. All right, so this is something I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, this idea, again, of relief. It influences how water flows, the shape of the landscape. And that's what we're all about. Many of you are called soil conservationists or soil conservation technicians or conservation technicians, and it's all about keeping soil on the landscape, preventing that sheet and rill and concentrated flow erosion. And so understanding your landscape shape and how that potentially affects erosion is really important. So on the left-hand side, you see this divergent hill slope shape. We call that convex. And you see the water is flowing off it, away. It's divergent. The water is not flowing towards itself. It's kind of flowing off the landscape. Here you might see a lot of sheet rill erosion if you're not controlling it. Then on the bottom block is convergent. That's where it's a concave shape. And you have water flowing, concentrating flow into the surface of a swale. And that's where you'll find in the middle of this, that's where you might find your ephemeral gully or your classic gully. And so you want to know where those things are on the landscape and potentially look for erosion going on there. And on the right-hand side, this is just another look of showing water in that landscape. In this case, you have a convergent landscape, and this blue sort of puddle is showing that you have water accumulating. So these areas may be wetter. At the break of the slope at the bottom, you might actually even have a wetland. And then these are the different types of water tables. Epiaquic means you have some kind of restrictive feature in the soil, and so the water it flows in and then it perches on top of this restrictive layer. And endoaquic is the water table is maybe coming up from the bottom. Maybe you're next to a river or a pond, or and the water is flowing up from the bottom. There's no restrictive layer that's perching the water to the surface. A good farm soil. This is very, very important. And you're going to learn a lot about soil health in your career. So a good farm soil, really only half of it is solid. So 45% is that mineral part, is the dirt part. Maybe 5% is organic matter. That's pretty good. Most of our Pennsylvania farm soils, we're trying to achieve 5% organic matter. Most of them are maybe 2 or 3% or less. And then what's not solids is air and water. And that air and water is critical for having that be an ecosystem that supports biology, that's alive. You need to have that water and air. So let's talk a little bit about that soil organic matter, because you can have whole courses on soil organic matter. This is where I think for us, the rubber hits the road. This is where when our dignitaries were talking about climate smart agriculture and how more and more is being expected of agriculture, this is what they're talking about, that soils can sequester huge amounts of carbon in the soil organic matter. And it also depends on, a lot of it is natural, but a lot of it depends on how you manage it. So soil organic matter, you can't say enough about how good it is for your soil. It improves the physical condition. It contributes to aggregation of soil particles. It increases water infiltration, and it acts as a sponge. So it itself holds more water, and then the soil naturally would itself, and it improves soil tilth. It helps just that crumbliness, the way the soil feels and the way plants can grow in it. Organic matter is super duper important. So there's two parts of it. we have a living portion. So these are the things that are alive, our microorganisms, insects, plants, earthworms, plant roots, all that stuff that's alive. Everything as it's respiring and metabolizing will exude substances. And many of these substances are very sticky. They're called glomalin. And that's what binds individual soil particles together to make these, what they call water stable aggregates. And fungi put out things called mycelium and hyphae. These are tiny microscopic threads, or sometimes you can even see them. And those bind soil particles together too to improve aggregate stability. And that's fungi are particularly sensitive to disturbance. And that's why if you have a farming system with a lot of tillage, you'll have less soil fungi there than in a no-till system. So the other part of organic matter is the dead stuff. And that's, all the dead things that have decayed or are decaying. And those can be food for soil, plants, and animals. And but also that some of that dead organic matter can become very stable and can exist in different forms for a long time in the soil profile. So organic matter, don't confuse necessarily organic matter with organic soils. Organic soils are soils that formed in bogs and wetlands or coastal marshes where you have the wetness has resulted in a large accumulation of decomposed and partially decomposed plant material. So the definition of a histosol, which is an organic soil, is at least 8 inches or more of this decomposed organic material. And you can have peat, which is not very decomposed, mucky peat, or muck, which is the really dark, black, greasy stuff. We don't farm we farm in these soils. Well, they can be drained and farmed, but we're trying not to do that now. But those are our organic soils. So what we're talking about with most of what we do is mineral soils. And so the mineral part of the soil profile is made up of 3 texture classes: sand, silt, and clay, and then of course varying amounts of organic matter. And so when we talk about soil texture, so when you read the soil survey or you're talking to a soil scientist and they say, oh yeah, this is a silt loam, or this is a silty clay loam, or sandy loam, they're talking about the relative proportions of these 3 particle sizes: sand, silt, and clay. So sand is your coarsest stuff, up to 2 millimeters. You can see it, you can feel it, and it's gritty. Silt is 0.05 to 0.002 millimeters. You can maybe see a individual silt particle, but it's pretty hard. But if you have a soil that's mostly silt, it'll feel very smooth and floury. It's almost like talcum powder. If any of you all might be actually too young to know what talcum powder is, but it's very soft and floury. And if you have a soil where it's highly influenced by clay, those are the smallest soil particles. You can only see them in an electron microscope, and that's what makes a soil feel sticky and stiff. And of course, clay pottery is made from soils that are mostly clay. So here's the soil textural triangle. And if you've taken a soils course in college, you've probably seen this. Otherwise, this may be all new to you. And when we go out to the field next week, you'll be going over a lot more of these physical properties, and you'll actually get to do soil texture and look at soil pits. So I'm going to go through a lot of this fast here, and you'll get to do it all hands-on when you're out in the field. So this is a textural triangle, and the main thing is that sand, silt, and clay has to add up to 100% in your soil sample. And in this textural triangle, you're reading it. The axes go clockwise along the outer perimeter of this triangle. So the bottom scale goes from 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 100, and that's your percent sand. So if you're on the left-hand side of this triangle, the lower left-hand side, that means your soil sample is largely sand. If you're on the right-hand side of this triangle, that means your soil sample is predominantly silt. If you're at the top of the triangle, it's clay, and then you have everything in the middle. And so you'll notice loam falls in the middle, or kind of middle-ish, and that's a loam soil has sand, silt, and clay kind of have an equal influence on the texture of that soil. And then you have different gradations in between. So little quiz here. So we're reading the percent sand from right to left on the bottom scale. We're reading the percent clay from the bottom up to the top on the left-hand side of the triangle. So for example, towards the top, you have 90 to 100% clay. And then on the right-hand side, going clockwise, is the percent silt. So if I have a soil that is it is 30% clay and 40% silt, what texture class am I in? Give you guys a few minutes, type your answers in the chat. Okay, so 30% clay, so you're reading this scale here, and 40% silt, so you're reading this scale here. Where those lines meet, what texture do you have? Come on, folks. Clay loam. Clay loam, that is correct. Somebody did say sandy loam, so I want to make sure folks that said that understand. So you're following the 30% clay line. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor on the screen. And then you look at the 40% silt, and that hits right in the clay loam. Okay, so if you have 30% clay and 40% silt, how much sand do you have to have? If it has to add up to 100, how much sand? You can either do the math in your head, or you can look at the chart. How much sand you have? If you have 30% clay and 40% silt, how much sand do you have to have? Okay, I'm seeing numbers coming in. And I'm seeing 30%. Very good. Very good, guys. So those of you that were able to do the math or look at the triangle, that is correct. So that's soil texture, sand, silt, and clay. I'm going to skip that because I don't want to talk about that. Okay, so why do we care about soil texture? Well, depending on the texture of the soil, it'll behave in different ways. But one of the things that we are interested in, as farmers are certainly interested in, is the total pore space. And so a fine textured soil, fine meaning smaller particles like clays, silty clays, clay loams, will actually have more total pore space, but each of those pore spaces will be very small. And then a coarse textured soil, like a sandy soil, a sandy loam, will have less overall pore space, but more macropores. This is very important. So of those two different textured soils, which one can water move more easily, and water and air can move around more easily in versus being trapped? You can type your answer in. If you have water and air, you want water and air to be moving through your soil. Which one, the coarse textured soil or the fine textured? This could be okay. I'm seeing some coming in. Okay, this is a trickier one. So those of you that are saying coarse, that is correct. You have more macropores, so more ability for water and air to get in. The fine textured soil will hold more water, but that water may not be available to the plants. And this is something that you can't change the texture of the soil. That is what we call an inherent soil property. But you can change like the structure, and I'll talk about structure in a minute, to mimic more of a coarse textured soil. How do we do that with organic matter? By putting living roots, having a very alive, biologically active soil. Those fine soil particles will aggregate together, and in a way, it'll give you a coarser, structured soil. The texture is the same. You can't change the amount of sand, silt, and clay, but you can change the orientation of the particles and affect how water and air move. This is key. This is very key. So this is